believe in the ripple effect.
What's up with another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast? I'm your host, Rico Levens, also known as Ricky France, and a great episode for you today. Returning guests, investigative journalist Whitney Webb, and also Ryan Cristián from The Last American Vagabond, a great source for alternative media. Check out his website, check out his YouTube channel. It's harder and harder to find good alternative media sites. So while he's still on YouTube and while his channel can still be found on Google, check out his work. Whitney Webb is also publishing on The Last American Vagabond now. A lot of her articles are on there. She used to work for MintPress News. Now she's working with Last American Vagabond, so another reason to check out his website. Both have been on the show a bunch of times. Ryan has been on one time before, but Whitney has been on a bunch of times. She was on my 200th episode. She was on last year when the Epstein case was getting huge and getting public attention. She came on. She was kind of the leading researcher in regards to the Epstein case because nobody went as deep as she did in that rabbit hole and really did some amazing research in regards to that. It's also a topic we talk about today. We talk about the Jeffrey Epstein case, obviously Maxwell getting arrested, all that stuff. We also talk about the COVID-19 stuff. We talk about some of the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. We hit on all the big topics, and it was a really fun discussion. And Ryan and Whitney always bring information and knowledge, so get ready to learn some shit. And also, if you want to support the show, we have a Patreon page. If you do support the show, I'll let you know in advance who's going to be on the show, who am I booking, all that type of stuff, because usually you don't know until I release these shows. So a little perk in helping the show financially. But if you can't help the show financially, like I always tell you guys, share the show with censorship getting in the way of finding a Last American Vagabond or finding work by Whitney Webb or even finding Ripple Effect Podcast. It's super important for you guys to share my podcast and any YouTube channel or anybody's work that is giving you a alternative perspective, because like I said, it's getting harder and harder to find those alternative media sites and perspectives. Also, RV Theory 6 is my YouTube channel. It's also my Instagram name. It's also my Twitter handle, and it's also my Parlay handle. Parlay is a Twitter alternative. It's supposed to be uncensored Twitter. For the time being, I like it. I'm on there. So check it out if you guys want to find a alternative to all these social media sites that have been proven to be censoring alternative media. So hopefully that's not the case with Parlay. So for the time being, I like it and I'll keep using it. I feel like there's some other stuff I should be telling you guys. Oh, I did a interview not too long ago on CFR Network. You can find that interview on my playlist called Ricky's Interviews. Very creative playlist title, as you can tell, but it gets right to the point. It's all interviews I've done in the past, including this recent one. It was a fun hour-and-a-half discussion, and just talked about everything from current events to history, so many different things. So censorship, really fun discussion. Check that out on my YouTube channel, RV Theory 6, and just go to the playlist, Ricky's Interviews. Also, you'll find a playlist with documentaries. A lot of them are being pulled, so watch them while you can. A lot of them are being either, I don't know if they're being censored or they're just being deleted or whatnot, but I'm seeing more and more of them kind of just disappear. So watch those while you can. Follow me on social media. Like the show, rate the show, review the show, support the show if you can. I have merch coming out very soon, some shirts. If you follow me on social media, you've seen some of the designs. I'm really excited about it. So going to be another way of supporting the show. So thanks again. Enjoy the conversation, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.
Yeah. Hi.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for being. I know, bad timing, because I was just following that the Maxwell hearing also.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can talk about it. I don't know. Maybe it would be cool if you could get this up when we finish, but I don't know how much time you need for like post-production stuff, because then it's like immediate video commentary on the stuff, right?
Yeah, no, I can probably get it turned around pretty quickly as long as it's not a whole lot of editing is necessary or whatnot. So, but yeah, where were you guys listening to it? Because I saw it on Sean's YouTube channel, but I didn't find anywhere else where they were showing it.
Well, I was following Adam Classfield, who's Courthouse News. I mean, he's like live tweeting it, and there's some other people tweeting about it as it goes on, right? So, I don't know. A lot is being said, but I kind of am still super cynical about the whole thing, right? So.
Oh yeah, I'm not actually following it necessarily more so than the updates today, but I'm sure I'm very, very skeptic. I mean, I'm just like I'm expecting exactly what I think is going to happen. That's why I'm not really too primed for it. But I think it's like we saw them not guilty plea today, and if this goes away where nothing actually changes when she gets a slap on the wrist, you know, the question is whether or not people like us and other people around us are going to actually do something about that, or just be like, right, you know, like last time.
Right. Well, besides like the not guilty plea that everyone expected from Ghislaine, right? The crazy thing is that the date for her trial is set for July of next year. It's not going to start until July 2021. Okay. So by then there's going to be like all this max vaccination stuff. The country is going to be like, you know, they're all setting up all these narratives about like after November for 2020, and like the country's going to be in civil war and martial law and all this stuff. And then, the Ghislaine Maxwell trial will happen next July, like totally normal. I think it's kind of interesting. They like, you know, are waiting a year for the thing. It's just wild. So,
isn't that one thing you know, noticed this stuff is that when they want something to happen, it can happen instantaneously, like 24-hour turnaround and bills are passing. But when it's something like this, it's just they just drag this stuff out. And half the time it's to waste up funds for other sides. But in this case, I argue it's exactly what Whitney said, just to make us forget. Now, by next year, we're going to be in our Orwellian technocratic surveillance state, and hopefully not. But right? I mean, are we going to be paying attention to stuff like that at that point? You know, who knows? They bank on it.
Well, that's the thing. Like, if this was 2019, a year from now, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Like, what could happen in a year? But now it's like, well,
right.
Like, you know,
think about how much has changed. Yeah. Good Lord.
Yeah. So that's I saw it. So I think I know, Whitney, you've been on Sean Atwood's show before, right? I believe. Yeah.
Twice.
Twice. Yeah.
We both have. I've been there once, I believe.
Oh yeah. He I just noticed he was. When I was at the office this afternoon, and then he had this live stream, and some way he's getting the audio from the actual.
Well, yeah, there's some places to find the live audio feed where you can listen in, but you're not allowed to record it, right? So, but you're allowed to stream it. So there's some people that have found how to listen to it that way. Yeah.
What's the logic?
And some other people. I don't know. It was just a stipulation of the hearing or whatever, right? People that were physically going to the courthouse, they only had 60 seats, had all their electronic devices confiscated at the doors, so no one could film or photograph Ghislaine, who's actually appearing by video conference. She hasn't appeared in person yet, right?
No way.
And there's no mugshot, and you know, I mean, who really knows what's going on, right? I mean, you know.
I actually didn't know that.
This whole thing
if it's video conference and she hasn't had a mugshot, I mean, is this even really happening? I mean, that's supposed to be totally taboo to say, right. But come on, that's crazy.
Well, recently, several months ago, the FBI said that they didn't have to have mugshots for like federal arrests or whatever, and so that's how they've been justifying the lack of mugshot. But it's just kind of like, you know, even Epstein had a mugshot at some point that came out, right? Man. So it's just odd. It's odd, but
yeah, I feel like it almost makes it easier to do some type of fuckery and mess around with things because you have all this COVID-19 stuff. So it's like, oh, we're not doing things as we normally do, which is usually the first indication something weird's going on, right? It's like, hey, they usually do this, but now it's like you don't know. Everything's a toss-up.
Yeah.
Well, the whole thing's playing into her push for bail too, right? That she's being like, I'll get COVID in prison. And now there's that bullshit New York Post article being like, Ghislaine is being moved from cell to cell to avoid the assassins, right? Which is like the craziest freaking story. Like there's all these like ninjas in prisons everywhere in the U.S. that like hunt people around, and they move them from cell to cell, and they can't like lock her down, you know, and that she's like, you know, just like prisons don't freaking work like that. Like if someone is moved to a cell because of a threat to their life and there's like subsequent threats, that's like with direct, you know, they're working directly with like a prison guard or like the whole prison, you know, it's like just so absurd. But I think all of that was planted to sort of justify bail, right?
Yeah, well, imagine Whitney, let's say you had written that article exactly like that before they had said that. That would have been fake news, conspiracy theory. But because they write that there's assassins and they're moving people from place to place, well, that's just mainstream journalism, you know, and it's just ridiculous, isn't it? How they can play the same narrative when they want to in reverse. It's just baffles me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, there were a bunch of crazy stories like this when Epstein was in prison the first time. Though the most interesting, though, was the alleged visit of Bill Barr to the prison before the first suicide attempt of Epstein, right? And that didn't get a lot of attention relative to some of the other ones. But I think, you know, it's all really going to come down to this whole, you know, is she allowed to post bail or not? Apparently she wants to spend her time, if she is granted bail, in a hotel in Manhattan. And get like an ankle bracelet or something, and that's supposed to be enough. And because of the charges she's facing, I really think she'll get it, because even though the prosecution is bringing up like all these testimonies of the victims and talking about her murky finances, none of that really directly applies to the charges she's facing, which are all about transporting minors across state boundaries for the purpose of illegal sex acts, right? So that doesn't relate directly to murky finances, and all the victim testimonies are about Ghislaine like being involved in sexual abuse, which is admitted to in the indictment, but they didn't charge her for that. They didn't charge her for rape, they didn't charge her for sexual assault, even though the indictment admits that, right? So, I mean, none of that technically factors into the bail thing. It's just honestly, I think, a show for the public to make the prosecution sound you know, like they're actually giving it a good faith attempt or something like that. It's also worth keeping in mind that the freaking judge on this case used to be deputy counsel for the Barack Obama White House, right? So this is definitely a judge that is like part of the system and was appointed to her current post by Obama. Let's remember that Hillary Clinton, right, you know, was in Obama's, you know, ran Obama's State Department, of course, has major ties to the whole Epstein thing. Ghislaine Maxwell's nephew, son of Isabel Maxwell, who has all these ties to like big name politicians and intelligence figures in Israel. Her son was appointed to be like the chief of staff of the Middle East desk in the State Department, like Clinton ran that, right? So like to have this judge like in charge of it and no one's like questioned, you know, her sympathy, you know, any conflict of interest there, when this is like a huge political blackmail ring that like transcends, you know, both parties and totally involves the Democrats and a lot of figures in the Obama administration, and she was directly part of that administration. It's just crazy.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest stories of our time, and unfortunately, I think it's going to be almost gone and forgotten because they just keep pushing all these other things. And
yeah.
I mean, the Filthy Rich documentary, even though I think there's a huge issue with the fact that like my wife, for example, liked it, but she liked it because it took a more personal, I guess, perspective, because it was just more about the victims and whatnot. But somebody like myself, it's like, well, there's a lot of other people he was linked to that could easily, I mean, he's gone, but there's plenty of other people that they could be investigating that they're not even discussing on this show. It's more about like how sad the story is. Well, it is sad, and there are victims, and that, you know, that's obviously a very important part of the story. But what's also very important, or more important, is the fact that there's still people alive who are part of this who could bring some justice, you know.
That's what I think this ultimately boils down to, and that's why, I mean, the Epstein case and the Maxwell part of this is obviously a monumental story. This Maxwell part of it, I'm not seeing this being as influential as, I mean, other than the fact that I also do agree that Maxwell definitely seems to be possibly more so the leader as opposed to the follower. But at the same time, this feels like an attempt to, if they bring down Epstein, It's one person. Based on the smallest amount of due diligence, it's clear it's far bigger than one person. So they know that we're all going, okay, what's next? Remember when Barr, after this ended, he said, I've got 6 ongoing investigations. Okay, it amounted to Maxwell, who we haven't even verified is even here. She could be in Israel broadcasting right now into this courtroom, right? So it just seems like to me, this is a way to put a pin in it and be like, okay, see, there was another person. Now we're wrapping it up for you. Nobody else will be, I mean, if we believe for 1 second, unless you buy into the idea that Trump is the savior fighting against this, which, God, I hope so. I just don't believe it. Other than that, I just don't think anyone's ever going to allow her to actually speak these names. These people, I mean, if that was the case, where's Clinton? I mean, the other people that are obviously tied up in this, Go ahead, Whitney.
Well, really quick, I wanted to point out that Filthy Rich, right, is based on the book by James Patterson about Epstein. James Patterson is also a co-author of books with Bill Clinton. Right. So I would argue that's kind of a conflict of interest. And that didn't really get brought up into the Netflix documentary at all. Another thing is that I think one of the reasons they're doing, what Ryan pointed out is because after Epstein was, Epstein or whatever, last year, one of the reasons that story refused to be memory hold was because people kept asking, where is Ghislaine Maxwell? Right. And so now they're making it look like, oh, we're doing something with Ghislaine. And that way, the ability to memory hole, it's a little bit easier. And they waited a year to the day almost of like all of Epstein's indictments to do so. When we have a news cycle dominated by, coronavirus, major geopolitical tensions with China that keep rising every day, major economic calamity, increased tech censorship. I mean, there's tons of stuff going on that really plays in the favor of memory holding all of this stuff.
Yeah, and
I would add.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to add one more point to the documentary aspect that I thought was interesting is that you made a really excellent point there, Ricky, that it's all about emotional manipulation in these things, right? And this is the same reason I keep pointing to in regard to the reason the Trump administration or any administration is using the idea of child exploitation to push censorship on the internet, right? They're trying to abuse the way we view these things to manipulate us. The documentary was exactly that. It's not that we shouldn't be outraged and emotionally upset about what's happening to these victims, but they focus on that so you don't think about all the other things they're tying to, and that's the way they play this. And then it makes us look bad if you're playing against the other side to say, that's not the most important part. And they say, well, you're allowing child exploitation, and it's a perfect way to avoid the full picture. That's what this all seems to come back to today.
Well, the other thing is like, there's a lot of people who think this is some isolated situation. I mean, Dennis Hastert, Speaker of the House, obviously had to step down. I mean, you look at the Jimmy Savile thing. I mean, that stuff didn't really become public, or it was weird because in a lot of cases, you saw that same thing with like Bill Cosby. It's like a little open secret that everybody kind of knows what's going on, but only after they get caught that everybody's like, yeah, everybody knew Bill Cosby was doing some shicey things, or everybody knew Jimmy Savile was doing some shicey. Yeah,
Weinstein,
right? Yeah, Weinstein. That's the other thing. Weinstein. I mean, who's obviously linked to the Obamas and Clintons, and was it the Obama daughters that worked for him or something like that? I remember. I'll have to look at that.
I know the Black Cube connection. That's the Israeli tie, the ex-Mossad Black Cube tie-in. That kind of feels like the whole same network as all of that,
Totally. Well, Harvey Weinstein was connected to Black Cube by Ehud Barak, right? Who was a close Jeffrey Epstein associate. Co-investor in Carbine 911, spent overnight visits at apartments owned by Epstein's brothers, stuff with underage girls from Eastern Europe, among other things, went to Epstein's island, right? Also, Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein at one point were business partners, part of investment groups together, among other things. They've been photographed together. I mean, they were part of the same nexus, essentially, right? Though they sort of operated in different spheres, I mean, Jeffrey Epstein was doing his thing as a billionaire philanthropist, and then you have Weinstein doing, Hollywood production and stuff like that and being on that sphere of things. You also had, I think Maria Farmer talked about how they were trying to she wanted to quit, and they offered to send her to work for Harvey Weinstein at one point when she didn't want to continue working for them. So it seems like they were sort of sharing the movement of these girls around, right, at one point or another. So I definitely think it was connected to an extent, right? Just, going over those connections in and of themselves.
Yeah, I just looked it up, and it was one of Obama's daughters intern for Weinstein. How crazy is that? I mean, it's just
fun.
It's so. I mean, but you look at like the Franklin scandal, the what is it? The Finders, the Nexium or what was
Nexium.
The other. I mean, there's been story of this stuff. It just nobody's really. I mean, this has been, and I think this. I think Whitney and I have talked about this in the past, and I've talked to a lot of people about this because it was always kind of unusual to me how a lot of people in alternative media knew who Jeffrey Epstein was and his name would be brought up, but the common person didn't know. And like that ABC, I think it was NBC or ABC reporter Amy, something that talked about how she had interviews and they didn't want to
Roblox. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And so it seemed like obviously the story was being suppressed. Then all of a sudden it's like everybody got the green light to talk about it. And overnight, like it just became a household name. And I mean, what was that? Why do you think that's all these other stories are still, out in the dark and not many people know what the Franklin scandal is or whatnot, but yet this story specifically got the okay to be like, well, you can discuss it now, even though you couldn't before.
I would say it's a release valve.
Well, I think yeah,
okay,
I agree with that. Oh, sorry, there's a lag on my end, but no, I totally agree that it was sort of like a controlled thing to essentially memory hold this. I mean, based on people who were aware of Epstein's arrest, mainly victims, before he was actually arrested. There were some guys in New York, a part of NYPD specifically, who were trying to go after Epstein after a statute changed, and in order to sort of control the release of what they were investigating, it was done in this way. And then was allowed to be talked about, and the media message was really carefully crafted from the beginning. If you think about it, I mean, it was like, oh, depraved billionaire, he didn't actually have any ties to Leslie Wexner. He just deceived the poor old man. And Ghislaine Maxwell only served Epstein because she was so in love with him, which is, the same one we're hearing, being propped up, a narrative that's being propped up now too, right? And so it was all organized to set all the blame for everything on Epstein, and then Epstein's taken out of the picture, and then after he's dead, everything that comes up in that case, they just blame on him. Oh, it's just him, that bad man, and everyone else is sort of cleared essentially of involvement. And a lot of the mainstream media reporting on Ghislaine after her recent arrest, right, has been pretty similar. Like, oh, she just did it for love, and she was manipulated by Epstein. She herself is claiming that she is a victim of his. She sued his estate, claiming to be a victim, when she was really like, the whole operation couldn't have happened without her, because from people that were, knew what Epstein was doing, they said he spent so many hours abusing girls, there was no way for him to manage any of the logistics or the recruitment of those girls, and all of that was Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah, it definitely seems like this is being allowed. I think we can all acknowledge that. I mean, we can see that the flow of suddenly all these people, like the Weinsteins, the examples where suddenly it's, oh, I knew the whole time. And it's all it takes a lot of courage to say that after now that, oh, so you knew he didn't say anything, and you can see that it was essentially allowed. And what we have to recognize is the government tie-in. And I think anybody researching it can definitely see that. It's not just some billionaire or some secret grouping of billionaires, or, it's the government entities, the Israeli government, the U.S. government, the intelligence ties. We see the Acosta aspect where we know that that's a factor here. And I think you mentioned the Franklin case. You go all the way back, and the one that really stands out to me, and all these incidents, whether it's Franklin or the Presidio military base, which is the one that I think is the most egregious, it's clear that there was government intervention to keep these things from being seen. It's the same thing happening today. And not to go too much detail, but the Presidio case, and for those that don't know this, it's simple to look up and it'll blow your mind. There was a bunch of, it was a kid, like a kindergarten or a school for young children on the base. And these young children, 3, 4, 5 years old, multiple children came down with sexually transmitted diseases. And they all ended up saying that it was all just, they basically brushed it under the rug and said, oh, it just they gave it some explanation. But how in the world could you explain something like that? You know what I mean? And so they just swept it away. And so that's the same thing we're dealing with today, whereas opposed to realizing that there's a all-encompassing government entity on the ground as well manipulating the story, they just want to sweep it away as one person. And all these people will come out with their emotional stories and manipulate people. And that's the way it's always going to go.
Yeah, the thing that is interesting, though, is when you really get deep into Maxwell's life, her father was like into prostitutes and all this stuff. And if you really, it's something I've talked about in the past. It's kind of a difficult or a conversation to have, because there's this internal dilemma in some cases. I'm not saying in this case, but in some cases, there's the victim that becomes the criminal, right? Like they end up being exposed to some weird sexual things, have some trauma they're dealing with, and next thing you know, they're doing the same thing. And it is a sad story because it's like, even though they do have to, I mean, they are, I guess, a criminal for their acts, they could maybe have prevented that journey or that road that they went down if they didn't deal with that trauma. And when hearing about her father, it makes me wonder, like, I wonder if she was sick and twisted because she was sick and twisted, or is she sick and twisted because of some trauma? And what's your guys' opinion on that? Because it does seem like he had this weird fetish with prostitutes and whatnot. And, you know, some people like prostitutes and they're fine, like Eddie Murphy. But other people, you know, who knows what other type of trauma she might have dealt with, and if it stopped there or if it was something much sicker or weirder.
Right. Well, that's been alleged, right, that Robert Maxwell actually sexually abused Ghislaine directly, but I haven't seen direct evidence of that, so I can't really speak to that. We do know that pretty early on she was involved with some odd people, including allegedly dating a guy that had close ties to Harvey Procter, who was a MP for the Conservative Party in the UK. And this is like in the 1980s, right? And at the time of this association, he was convicted of sexual misdemeanors with like 17-year-old boys and things like that, and was later connected to this VIP sexual abuse ring involving Jimmy Savile and Ted Heath of the UK, right? That you sort of alluded to earlier, Ricky. But it's also worth pointing out that there are some weird things just with the Maxwell family in general, in terms of like her sisters, Isabel and Christine, like who their husbands were. So like Christine Maxwell's husband is a guy named Frank Molina, or Roger Molina, who's the son of Frank Molina. And Frank Molina was in this weird occult Aleister Crowley-based sex magic group with L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons, right? And he founded the Jet Propulsion Lab at NASA. And his son, Roger, Christine Maxwell's husband, also had affiliations with NASA, right? So it's just kind of weird. You think of like what Ghislaine's into and like these weird ties, and you're like, what to make of this, right? Then you have Isabel Maxwell's first husband, Dale Gerasi, who was involved with like some sort of, you know, film career, Hollywood stuff. Isabel met him after she made some film about like lesbians or whatever, and then he gets involved in controversial art that came up after he became publicly a public issue of contention, I guess, after he donated publicly to Hillary Clinton, because it involved like some naked guy in a Batman mask being whipped and them trying to nail him to a cross. That seems really normal, like normal behavior, right? So, you know, this is like the whole family. So like maybe there's some weird stuff going on there. I don't really know. But Robert Maxwell, in terms of prostitutes, I mean, he was well known to use them, right? And to the extent that every time he would go to Tel Aviv or visit Israel, they would have, you know, prostitutes waiting for him and would actually film him, even though he was working for them. And they had like according to Gordon Thomas's book, Gideon Spies, had like a small library of videos of Maxwell in compromising situations with a variety of women. So yeah, he was definitely well known for his sexual appetite, I guess you could say. And, you know, Ghislaine really isn't that different. And speaking of how people knew about this the whole time, right? I mean, you have reports in UK newspapers from 2003 talking about how Ghislaine Maxwell would host parties for young girls, that's a direct quote, right, where she would brandish whips and train them in sexual techniques, right? So like the type of stuff she was doing to like Epstein victims, and like, you know, I mean, that totally confirms things that like, you know, Virginia Roberts has said about what Ghislaine Maxwell's role there was, right? I mean, this stuff was known and publicly reported, you know, years before Epstein was arrested the first time. So there's definitely a tendency among these elite circles to turn a blind eye to that stuff and be like, this is normal, you know, but to the general public, you know, it was always dismissed as conspiracy theory and whatever. And now, because of QAnon and that movement's interest in the type of stuff, people are conflating the real existence of that type of activity in elite circles in the US and elsewhere with QAnon craziness, right? To sort of just dismiss it all, you know, outright when we can document that it exists, right?
Which is the whole point of that. the whole point. And this country has a very, very clear history of having ties, whether it's elite culture or not, elitist culture or not, to occultist practices. I mean, going as far back, there's a great article on Last American Vagabond about Walt Disney, one of these, painted as one of these most holistic characters, which in fact was, I don't want to get into it on the show, but it's pretty crazy stuff that these people are in, and the circles that tie back to even the schools they come from. It's a whole show we could go on about that stuff, and it's yet we act today like we get the example in the Pizzagate scenario of Maria Abramovich, right? These little peaks of stuff like that, and they brush it off as art or something, or the paintings in their houses, but it's, the picture is very clear. And so we see these things and we always get them, we just brush them off and act like they're not there. But it's a classic thing. And you could tie lines to things like Freemasonry or Jesuits or things like this. There's a lot of theories, but I think it's very clear that it's a prevalence in our society and especially this country.
Yeah, some of the artwork these guys are into, and I grew up listening to heavy metal and industrial music. I loved the dark. I remember being a kid, like buying Cannibal Corpse album, and it was like really dark stuff. And I was very artistically just open to the idea of like, hey, artists should be able to go down any path they want and be as dark as they want, because it's not necessarily me. It doesn't mean that you're a sick person. I think actually somebody from Cannibal Corpse got arrested for for a murder or something, so they're a bad example. But in some in the death metal scene, it was quite normal to have really dark album covers and really dark lyrics. Slipknot's first album, when that came out, it was really dark or whatever. So the artist in me sometimes wants to say, well, don't judge them just because they're into really dark art. But then the father in me, having kids, and you see some of the little kid stuff, that's when it gets really weird. Because even with the Pizzagate stuff, obviously that was a story that everybody says was debunked and there was nothing there. It's like, well, nothing proven there, but one thing that it did show that there's some weird shit going on, because his Instagram page, all those photos, his link to politicians. There's just, maybe you guys know much more about this than I do, but it seemed like there was definitely some dots there. I don't know if it was completely the dots connected and if the picture was clear, but it definitely seemed like there was something weird about that.
I can tell you right now that this is the manipulation of Pizzagate, is that the emails and the documents and the words and the picture, that's all it was, right? That's all that, in my opinion, is very clear, but it's still all circumstantial. It's all just simply surface level. And yes, it could just mean hot dog. Do I think it just means hot dog? No, I don't, but it could, right? But if you just focus on that, and you had a lot of people like that during the time, what was his name? The Fulcrum News guy, I forget his name now. And that's all he would do is circle back and emails, and it's proof. And we all see it. And that made it look fake. Even though he's not wrong in a sense, he's only focusing on that. The problem is you've got things like Laura Silsby, or now Laura Gaylor now, or, with Hillary Clinton getting caught smuggling Haitian children across the border and getting it ignored, and these were the real origins of this stuff, the idea of these actual networks and how this all fit together. And ultimately, not necessarily that there's a basement full of children, right, in that one place, but that there's just a network and that these people are tied into it, right? And that, in my opinion, is very clear. Now, you could argue that Clinton is tied into that or not. And there is, in my opinion, very clear circumstantial evidence, like the ties to Laura Silsby and any number of things we could go off on. But at the end of the day, that one little part of the emails was just like imagine you're building the story with the Laura Silsby idea and you catch them trafficking children. And then you find emails where they're discussing the idea of things that don't make sense, that clearly use pedophilic code words and FBI symbol, all this stuff. It just adds together, right? And that's the real point. Now, it's hard to explain this all, especially for all the people out there that have been, told that it's completely fake. I just recommend you do your research. A lot of stuff's on our website. Even an article talking about how Pizzagate was used to debunk itself in a certain way. But just look at Epstein. Look at Whitney Webb's amazing work on this topic and how it's very clear that there was a sexual blackmail network trafficking young children. So, what's fake about that? You know what I mean? It's like, so is it not possible that Epstein or people like that couldn't use shops and locations in prominent areas to reach those people that we know they were, providing? It's a weird disconnect, don't you think? It's pretty clear that this stuff is real.
Well, what they what was debunked, I guess, for lack of a better term, was the fact that maybe there weren't trafficking people in that exact pizzeria, and there wasn't some dungeon there where kids were being raped or molested or whatnot. But it doesn't mean the accusation that that stuff doesn't exist, that isn't happening.
Right.
And that's
which is what they were conflating it with. Exactly.
And that's what was bothering me, because people would be like, oh, it's debunked. I'm like, well, what are you debunking? The fact that people that are human trafficking, child trafficking, that there's links to child trafficking and that the elite and certain people of power and politicians, because that is, you can't debunk. I mean, there's situations that you can, like you said, there's dots that you can connect, and again, like not, I guess, evidence to say that the Clintons are directly linked, but there's enough evidence where you can be like, okay, this is more than just a coincidence that they're connected. And at least, like you said before when we're talking about Bill Cosby, if you know what's going on and you say nothing, aren't you equally as guilty? And that's the thing about like a lot of these high-ranked, people talk about the Trump lovers will be like, well, he's, he cut ties with Epstein. Well, he also said in a quote that just like himself, Epstein likes women on the younger side. So he kind of knew, that was like a hint that he kind of knew what he was up to and what he was doing. And if all you do is say, hey, I don't want to hang out with you anymore, even though I know you're doing some illegal shit, like you're still like a little to blame, I would say, So I think this idea of like, well, these people might have known and they didn't say, I mean, even Alan Dershowitz, how the hell would he have not known? I mean, he hangs out with them. He was on his island. I mean, you have all these witnesses talking about young girls everywhere and all. I mean, like, you're supposed to be one of the most intelligent attorneys in the U.S. and you couldn't figure out that there's something weird about all these young girls hanging out on this island. You didn't ask any questions. Like, the whole thing, I think is just so obvious. So when people kind of get get a pass, like, oh, well, Bill Gates he said he didn't know him. Well, but he lied about when he met him and how well he knew him and all this stuff. Like, there has to be a reason for this. So even if he wasn't directly a part of the actual act, knowing and not doing anything, to me, it's almost equally as bad.
Yeah, completely agree.
Question, but I'm going to do this often, where I'm just going to leave you guys hanging.
Well, I mean, you did bring up the Gates tie, right? So, I mean, we can go into that a little bit because there's been like a huge cover-up of the Bill Gates Jeffrey Epstein relationship. So originally, I think Bill Gates said, oh, I didn't meet him until like 2014 or 2016, somewhere in that ballpark. And the New York Times came back and was like, haha, we found proof that you knew him in 2011. But I mean, that is just like huge, complete BS in my opinion. There's a 2001 article in the UK newspaper, the Evening Standard, that talks about Jeffrey Epstein specifically in relation to Ghislaine Maxwell. And what it says is he's talking about like who Jeffrey Epstein is and where his money comes from. It says his millions, all his money comes from the business links, his business links with three guys. Leslie Wexner, who we all know about, right, in connection with Epstein's finances. Donald Trump, who, that's pretty much documented too, the whole like real estate thing. And then 3, Bill Gates. This is in 2001. Why did no one follow up on this about the Bill Gates ties before then? I think I've pretty much found it out, and I have an article that's going to be, well, it's up for patrons right now, but it'll be made public probably tomorrow, talking about how that tie, well, anyway, so in 1995, Maria Farmer said that she heard Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein talking about Bill Gates like they knew him really well. At that time, Ghislaine Maxwell was directly involved in a company that was being run by her sisters and was largely financed initially by their brother, Kevin Maxwell, who was number 2 in Robert Maxwell's empire and his like heir apparent, right, who inherited all the shady financial stuff. Anyway, that company was called the McKinley Group, or the Magellan Search Engine. Right, and they had a major strategic alliance with Microsoft that was personally brokered between Bill Gates and Isabel Maxwell. Then when that company is sold off in 1996, Isabel Maxwell is chosen by this software company based in Israel with ties to Israeli military intelligence to become the head of their company, and she puts them on the map by personally negotiating investments with Bill Gates and the other Microsoft co-founder, Paul Allen, who poured all this money into this company, which became super integrated into Silicon Valley and was really the pioneer of this movement that I write about all the time, or this policy rather, where it's about, Israel's government has this explicit policy with support from like neocons like Paul Singer in the US to get Unit 8200 or Israeli military intelligence companies super embedded in Silicon Valley companies, right? So the person that pioneered this, it was Isabel Maxwell with, with Bill Gates basically. So, there's some really crazy Maxwell ties to the Gates, and I think there's a reason why no one bothered to investigate, that mention in 2001 of, Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein's business links, right? So, there's definitely a lot more there. And I have a feeling that a lot of these other guys that claim they only met him then, they don't know anything or whatever, have similar ties going, way back too, because Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just doing sexual blackmail, and neither was Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell, during this period of time that I'm talking about with, Magellan and McKinley and her sisters and Bill Gates and all of that, told newspapers her job was being an internet operator. Okay. What does that mean, right? So there's definitely some weird stuff going on there. Jeffrey Epstein, of course, when his whole sexual blackmail operations exposed, immediately begins rebranding himself as an investor in Silicon Valley and high tech. Why is that? I would argue, and what I'm arguing in my upcoming series, right, is that, this is all sort of what followed Robert Maxwell's involvement in the Promise software scandal, in which Christine and Isabel Maxwell, his daughters and Ghislaine's sisters, also had a major role. Right, because one of the front companies he used to sell Promise in the U.S., Christine Maxwell was president and CEO, and Isabel Maxwell lived next door and also worked there, while they were selling bugged software to U.S. national laboratories at Sandia and Los Alamos. Yeah. Why has no one covered this stuff? It's so crazy.
Yeah, that's I remember. And that reminds me of Danny Castellero, because that was linked to the Promise software and whatnot.
Right.
But, yeah.
And about Castellero, right? When did Castellero die? 1991, right? And what was clearly a murder, in my opinion, and the opinion of most people that actually bothered to look into it, including Castellero's own family. Also, it was the year that Alan Standorf, one of Castellero's main sources regarding the Promise software and the main core database, also murdered. But it's worth pointing out, too, that two other people died that year. One of them was Robert Maxwell, in what is largely regarded as a homicide perpetrated by these same intelligence services that he was, helping, because he started to threaten that he couldn't, promise them his silence anymore if they didn't help him rescue his, his business empire from major financial trouble. The other person that died in 1991 was Senator John Tower, who used to be head of the Senate Armed Services Committee and was hired by Robert Maxwell on behalf of Israeli intelligence to be a consultant to Robert Maxwell, and is the guy that got him basically a meeting with the Los Alamos and Sandia National Lab complexes in order to sell the bug Promise software to those laboratories and give Israel a backdoor into the very heart of the U.S. nuclear weapon system. So he also gets dies in a really suspicious plane crash where the plane was flying fine and then automatically starts spiraling for no reason, and the black box was never recovered and it was never investigated, and, typical.
It is. It's funny how if that stuff happens in another country, we would be like demon for not investigating it, and for it's a cover up. Right. Look at the way they treat people. And when that stuff happens here, it's like, no, like the Clinton body count. No, that's all just, it's like, well, it can't all be a coincidence, right? You can't just do all of it. I sometimes I say, like, the U.S. almost seems like a mild version of North Korea. Like, everybody thinks like the country is quite different than it really is, and like nobody thinks they're brainwashed, and they're aware of it, because it's sometimes it boggles my mind when people talk about like other countries getting involved in elections, or other countries being involved in assassinations, and other countries, doing all the same things we do. And it's like, wait, like, we do all that stuff too. Like, it just boggles my mind.
It's all about perception, right? People in the U.S. perceive themselves as being different, but at the end of the day, every government everywhere does this stuff. They kill people that get in the way of their like business model or whatever. They conduct assassinations. Like, almost every government does the sexual blackmail stuff their intelligence services do, because blackmail and secrecy and deception, that's the currency of intelligence agencies everywhere, not just the U.S., not just Israel. This is something that governments and agencies engage in all over the world. And essentially, intelligence agencies operate as organized crime networks, and, the government, by extension, is involved in that to a significant degree. The U.S. government, is super involved in drug running, human trafficking, all of the, arms trafficking, all of this stuff, right? And it's something that is shared by governments around the world, whether it's, like Russia and China do this stuff too, right? But they're like on one side, oh, these are the bad guys and the US are the good guys and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I mean, they pretty much engage in a lot of the same activities that like we, the people, like regular people, right, would just find like abhorrent and awful. But I mean, this is just how governments today operate.
One of the really interesting things that I picked that really stood out to me in one of Whitney's earlier articles about this, I think this was one I interviewed you about before you had left MintPress in regard to this same topic, that it's really interesting to consider that especially for those right now who don't want to believe that this is how our government is, that it's bad apples, right? That there's just a couple people and that there's good people somewhere, which may be the case, and we should all hope for that. But recognize with the Epstein thing, right? Whether Epstein was there at the time, whatever, how far back we want to go, the Mossad or CIA intelligence kind of idea of influencing a government using blackmail to siphon off information, control them going forward. And as we pointed out a long time ago in the interview, the idea that there was a very predominant aspect of Jewish people involved in the mob at that time in regard to the United States, which could have been influenced from another government from outside. And the idea that we could be staring at that influential takeover of our government all the way back then. So in fact, it would actually be the mob, right? Not just that they're acting like the mob, but we witnessed, or rather didn't see, the actual transition of power between who we thought were people that founded this country and going forward to an actual organized crime unit that just suddenly started pretending to be the government. And it may be hard for people to wrap their minds around, but again, I reference you to her work, and it really paints a picture of how that's probably where we are, and they just learn to act like government versus criminals. Really,
right. Let me add some context to that really quick. So what Ryan's referring to is a group called the National Crime Syndicate that officially was created in the 1920s. It brought together the Italian Mafia led by Charles Luciano and Mayor Lansky, and in the orbit of Jewish mobsters that he led, right? And during World War II, that National Crime Syndicate allied directly with the Office of Strategic Services, which was intelligence during the war that later gave way to the CIA, right? And after that, after the war ended, that alliance continued despite the fact that it was originally justified out of wartime necessity. That's why when Alan Dulles is the first CIA director, you see a bunch of Mayor Lansky associates being added to CIA assassination teams and the direct involvement of Mayor Lansky's network and efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro, for example. Among other things, you also see ties of that mob syndicate, to some extent in the JFK assassination, among other things too, right? On the other side of that, you see the Italian Mafia, because during that period, right, Charles Luciano was deported to Italy. So basically a lot of that portfolio stayed with Mayor Lansky, who, of course, with the creation of the State of Israel, his dream was to expand his mob empire into Israel directly, which of course ended up happening. And you have a lot of mob-linked billionaires with ties to Mayor Lansky being major funders of, financing major arms deals to Israel when it was first created, like Samuel Bronfman, for example. You have that going on. On the other side of this, you have, Luciano being deported to Italy, and that's where a lot of this Operation Gladio stuff comes from, which was the CIA, the Vatican, and the Mafia, specifically tied to Luciano, doing all of these operations on behalf of the CIA and things like that, over in Europe, and a spat of assassinations over there. So, that's just like, a brief summary of like how this, what Castellero called the octopus, right? Like how far those tentacles extend, that a lot of it had to do with the essential marrying of this criminal network and the CIA back then. But it's worth pointing out too that like the CIA was never about U.S. national security. You look at the history of Alan Dulles, its first director. I mean, he really got his start at Sullivan and Cromwell, a Wall Street law firm that was known for overthrowing governments for corporate clients. And of course, that's what the CIA ends up doing when it's created, right? So, you essentially have, the corporate mob, like people like Sullivan and Cromwell. I mean, that's essentially what they were doing, right? On behalf of rich clients, they would go in and like, engage in criminal activity, the overthrow of governments. And that's what the CIA would do under Dulles, to a significant degree, right? So, it makes sense why they, partner up together, but that's essentially the power structure. Obviously, it's changed in the decades since, but, that's basically the, how we got here, explains a lot of what we're seeing now.
I feel what they changed was simply the surface level appearance of it, right? Like we go back to the idea of South America and the, overthrowing countries for fruit companies. That was very clear because there was no internet. And now it's like, well, now we have to create this fancy picture and the illusion of we're saving and rescuing people. And then we can go over and remove that company. And, and it's just, I think it's the same thing, and that's a scary thing to think about. If that entity like took control back then and we're just watching it play out now, it accentuates the point that we really have no control. Just think we do.
Totally. Well, they started rebranding a lot of that stuff, like the humanitarian regime change push that came in like the mid 90s, especially with the whole Balkans thing. And you see a lot of that, NGO, humanitarian regime change, manufacturing consent for good regime change operations starting then. And of course, that's used to great effect under the, Obama administration, for example, in Libya and then later Syria. To a huge degree, right? So, they definitely have tried to manage the perception of this type of stuff that they've been doing all along, but they've been trying to sell it to us as like, we're humanitarian, good, do-gooders and all this stuff since then. And you still see that today. But I mean, honestly, at this point, like the Trump administration is so much worse than past administrations and like keeping that mask on, right? I mean, they're just very in your face and they like clearly don't give a shit about like being exposed for like how insanely hypocritical they are, about stuff like, how they justify sanctions as like helping people and, things like that. I mean, Mike Pompeo is like a good example of that and how, the Trump administration is, basically made the State Department a direct, salesman of weapons. Like it's now State Department, it has been for a couple years, State Department policy to, when you meet with foreign diplomats, try and sell U.S.-made weapons at the same time, right? So it's just like a more overt, I mean, obviously the State Department engaged in that stuff before, right? But the Trump administration has just made it, just kind of more in your face to a significant degree. And of course, Trump's tendency in terms of his rhetoric to be more brash and blunt, and not, talk the same way, as smoothly, let's say, as someone like President, Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or whatever, is part of that to an extent.
And I would add, as well as just not ignoring the patch-up jobs. Like, look at Bolivia. That's the most apparent, obvious, on its face military coup overthrow of a country, and they even got caught. MIT comes out with a study. Here, look, they lied. And then we go, well, we're over here now. Who cares? Like, they're not even trying to patch that up. Like, we see that was a military overthrow by our government. That's the Trump part, right? He just, whatever, is moving forward.
Hey, but now, that part of the motivation was the coup was to take the lithium deals with Bolivia's state government under Evo Morales and China and give it to Elon Musk. Because now Janine Áñez's government in Bolivia, right, the coup-installed government announced that that mine that was going to be part of that joint Bolivia-China deal was shut down, and now Elon Musk is going to go there and open up, a factory in its place.
Crazy.
Yeah, the government and the mob is not that different when you look at the way they work, and they both want their cut, right? If you're doing business, they want their cut, even if they have nothing to do with your business, right?
There's a great quote about that, actually, about Mayor Lansky when he tried to evade charges that he was facing in the U.S. He eventually went back to the U.S. to face the charges and didn't get convicted of anything, right? But, he was, he went to Israel and he was talking to Israel's, I think, his finance minister and trying to figure out taxes. And the finance minister told him, we're going to take this much of your money in taxes. And Mayor Lansky was like, you guys are the real mob. I've been doing it wrong this whole time, basically, So, I mean, that really says a lot, doesn't it?
My favorite example of that, and I know there's plenty more of them, is something like with Assange or people like this. They're in that position that end up trying to write a book about things, and they go, well, that's fine. You just we get the proceeds from that book. It's like, wait, what? You're just going to take the money from the thing that you're trying to cover up? Like, it's such clear mob tactics. We just want our cut, exactly like Ricky said. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's the exact same. I mean, you think about it. If you win the lottery, they get a huge percentage of that, even though they didn't put the game together. They didn't invest in it in any way. But yet they're winners also because they get a huge percentage. I mean, it's just the most ridiculous thing ever. That's the thing about this COVID-19 thing that drives me crazy.
Really quick about the lottery. Okay. Apparently, Epstein won the lottery like in Oklahoma or something.
I didn't know that.
That wasn't rigged or something,
Whitey Bulger, the same thing, won the lottery like 2 or 3 times,
Right.
I mean, it's great for money laundering. You know, that's what they use it for. Yeah. You'd buy the ticket, winning ticket. Yeah. It's the whole thing is crazy. But it's just, to me, you know, one thing I love about the alternative media is that people ask these questions. Like when something seems silly, you know, for example, like growing up, I was never a big fan of rules. You know, I always liked, I wouldn't push the limits and get, you know, arrested or whatever, but I would question things like, why, like, where's the logic in this, or what's the point of doing this or whatnot. And you found at a young age that people didn't like that. People didn't like you questioning authority. And what happens is when you go to public schools, you know, now there's all this conversation about homeschooling, and, you know, a lot of parents are really having second guesses about sending their kids to school because there's all these guidelines on like kids wearing masks. I mean, I told my wife, if our kids, I say my kids, like they're only mine, but if our kids have to wear masks, then we're homeschooling, you know, and until this clears up, if it doesn't, I guess we'll figure it out then. But and Ryan had a great video talking about the masks and how OSHA uses these meters to see if you're working in a unsafe environment, and you put these meters underneath your mask and you're breathing, and it's basically starts beeping immediately saying that you're you know, in an unsafe environment. The oxygen levels are too low. So I mean, to think about like cognitively what effects it could have on your child every day being like that. Obviously kids, personally, I don't think they're going to keep them on their face anyways. I mean, they're going to play with them. They're going to touch them. They're going to probably touch their face way more than they would normally because of the mask. Yeah. So I think that's another issue. But, you know, people are just, there's so many people who are just like, just do it because it's the right thing to do, or if it saves one life, and it's, yeah, you know, and the thing that drives me nuts, it's like, you know, it's that old quote, you know, anytime you sacrifice freedoms for security, you gain neither or lose both. However it goes, I'm sure I ruined the quote, but it was much more poetic the way I said it. But
it's fine.
But it is one of those things where it's true. And so many of these old quotes, regardless how many years ahead you look at things, they still end up being true and make sense today, because even though our technology and so much of our surroundings have changed, like a lot of times when you read old quotes, you know, or Twain or whoever it may be who said something really clever, it still makes sense today because human nature hasn't changed, you know, and a lot of the way we do things and our ambitions and our motivations, all these things that make us human really haven't changed. But you live in Texas, Ryan, right?
No, I don't. I moved a while back.
Oh, did you? Okay. Well, where do you live now? Are you dealing with any type of possible new lockdowns? Because a lot of places, including Texas, now they're in California. They just announced that they're going to start shutting things down again. I mean, these restaurants that are already barely surviving, and people who are barely surviving, and you do this, like, I mean, this could be even worse than we expected.
Yeah, no, right now where I'm at, I'm already seeing more mask mandates. I mean, I actually took a couple pictures of things saying like, well, we're short on coins now for some reason because of the Federal Reserve, so we need cashless things. Like this whole thing's going forward. But the mandates, the masks, and the shutdown stuff is happening pretty much everywhere now, and it is pretty wild and unconstitutional at the end of the day. Most places I see are, and as I said before, not to get into that conversation entirely, but everyone should have the right to do what they want to do. It just boils down to you shouldn't be forced to do something. And then I could go into why I think we still, you know, the science is behind that, not doing it either way. But stores around here are not really pushing it. You know, you go in, they're saying, you know, hey, you got to wear a mask. And we go, okay. And they just let you go. You know, that's their job as the store and the corporate entity. I had this thought, actually, interestingly. I would say right now in my town, easily 80% of people are not buying it, right? They're not going along with, at least don't want to do it. However, you get the impression that it's here because all of your corporate entities are doing it. Every store you go into, and it's because those corporations aren't based in this town, right? So you get this weird spin on your perspective, even when your town's not kind of a part of it, you know? But it's definitely happening, and I think we have to be able to say no to this for very basic reasons. One, because you said it's not safe, and two, because it doesn't actually protect you, and the science is clear on that. I even showed you about cloth masks. One of the last studies in regard to from the NIH showed that the cloth homemade masks actually cause you to get more sick. That's their own study. It said something of 96% more, like some crazy number. I have to look at it. I can grab it if you'd like. That makes you more sick because the cloth grabs the moisture and all these different things. And that's their study, and yet they're still forcing us and telling us we should need. Not only that, there's some places telling you that's the best thing to do. That's just crazy, right? I mean, that's independent of the science.
Well,
I don't understand this.
Well, there was just like this new study in the New England Journal of Medicine, right, that was saying that, masks don't really help anything and they're counterproductive. And they called mask mandates like a reflexive policy about anxiety over the pandemic, and basically said it was useless. And it got, no media coverage from mainstream media at all, which is just totally insane when you think about it. So, basically this is something like after 9/11, when at the airports, you have to take off your shoes, you have to get in the radioactive scanner thing, and it's about compliance. It's about, will you do this? I mean, it's all like obedience training, in my opinion, because the science is pretty clear that it doesn't help the way they claim. And even you have that New England Journal of Medicine study come out. You have the NIH study that Ryan referenced. You have the CDC director today saying, well, if everyone just agrees to wear their mask for 4 weeks and the pandemic goes away, so they can blame all the non-mask wearers, the people that don't comply, for when, the pandemic is still going on a few months from now, right? And be like, well, it's because they didn't comply. So that sends the message like, well, if you comply, things will get better. Obedience training. And it's worth pointing out that, like in Chile, right, mask mandates are even much more widespread than the U.S. now. The government a week ago mandated masks in all urban areas. I have a friend that was waiting outside like a cell phone store and had the cops called on him for not wearing a mask, and they came up on motorcycles and like chewed him out and threatened him with whatever, and gotta wear a mask now. It's worth pointing out that Chile, since the overthrow of its government in 1973 in a U.S.-backed military coup, has essentially been a laboratory for economic and social experiments later implemented in the U.S., right? So a lot of the things that they want to do in the U.S., they usually test out in places like Chile, or they test out in places like the Philippines, or places like that before it goes live in the U.S. So you have, national mask mandates in Chile. They're seeing how that's going to go. They've developed an AI algorithm or program that can go on any existing camera and can determine if you are wearing your mask properly, if you are exactly 200 centimeters away from the person next to you, how many people are in a room. And they're putting this in all the one of the main supermarket chains that's owned by Walmart, and the main department store called Falabella in all of Chile, right? So they're like rolling this stuff out there. I'm sure it's only a matter of time before they try and do it there. Also, Chile has already mandated that every kid going to school, public or private, before Chilean school starts next March, gets the COVID-19 vaccine.
What? See, now, since I want to make, for people out there watching, and I'll make sure I'll send these to you, Ricky. I hope you should include these 4 studies with whatever we're posting today. It's very important for people to understand that what Whitney said is 100% accurate. I mean, the science is actually there in regard to these things, and it's the most recent information right up to May 2020 from the CDC. There's 2 studies from 2015, June or July and April, one of which was proving between cloth masks and regular masks, both of which showed no evidence that actually did anything to protect you. Point of fact, which the actual box says on these masks, it says they do not protect you, which I don't know why that's not included. But then we have the May 2020 direct from the CDC website that says verbatim that there's not enough evidence to suggest that they have any effect either for the patient or for the doctor. Now, these are all from the CDC and the NIH. So what's the disconnect, right? You can't cherry pick when you're pulling from the most recent information. And as you pointed out, the OSHA documents show that this is happening right now. And on their website from the most recent update, it says for cloth and for surgical, neither one will protect you from viruses, point blank. And then when you realize that they're saying that, no, it won't stop, it's about stopping the droplets and things from flying. It's about protecting them, not you. Okay, well, then how does it work if it only goes, masks don't work one way. If it doesn't work this way, then it's not going to work that way. So it's just this weird deception around all of this is irrational, and it's based on fear. So all I ask is people to go out there and actually look into the studies that I'll provide and shows. And remember also that Masks for All is this new push coming out that's pushing for masks everywhere all the time. And that's it stems back to Davos. And this ties in with the whole big thing, right? And these are the same groups that are pushing for this whole same thing. Texas is now saying you should wear masks inside your home. It's just this push going forward based on the absence of scientific data as they grasp at, well, just do it because why not? If it stops 1%, then why not? That's not science, right? It's just, I hope.
No one cares about science anymore, right? I mean, there was this study that wasn't really even a study that got promoted in CNN that was like, don't flush don't use public restrooms because when you flush a toilet, virus plumes come out of the toilet and will infect you. Like, okay, so we should go back to outhouses. I mean, that is the most like 2020 thing ever, that like a freaking outhouse is supposed to be like, more safe for your health than like a regular restroom. I mean, like the stuff is so just totally insane and makes no sense,
Well, being exposed to viruses is a part of being alive. Like we're constantly, that's the other aspect. I mean, the other thing too is on the CDC website, it says that there's no way of them knowing for sure that they're testing you or that you test positive for the specific coronavirus that causes COVID-19 or any other coronavirus. They still don't know that for sure. So never mind the fact that a lot of these tests are giving false positives. So they're giving false positives, and they could even be giving you a false positive for the wrong virus. So like even talking about the masks, like sometimes it's like, okay, well, it could stop the spread, could not. Like to me, it's like sometimes it's like, well, let's go back to the foundation that built this whole BS. Like the numbers don't make any sense. They've been wrong with all the predictions. They lied about. I mean, Fauci lied about the masks initially. That's what he says, that because he wanted to save supplies. But it's like, okay, well, he's admitting that he lied. So either he was lying then or he's lying now. I mean, we obviously caught him in a lie or being deceiving at least. So it's like, how can you believe anything he says? The same way that he had other intentions or other motives for why he said something specifically in that 60 Minutes interview. Why couldn't he be motivated by some other thing also not aware of right now when he talks? I mean, he's admitting that other things that we're not aware of could be motivating this what he's saying. So what he's
Fauci's been in government for what, like 40 years? I mean, you don't stay in a position like that for that long in the U.S. government unless you are corrupt as hell, right?
Yeah. Well, he was a part.
He's had his hands in.
He was part of the AIDS epidemic. He had huge predictions for that. He was quoted saying that he was glad that he was wrong because it helped people take it seriously. So he already has that mentality. Obviously, he was a part of that money that was going to the Wuhan lab, all this stuff. I mean, there's all these connections. And one thing that I think that's coming out of all this that from a positive perspective is that people who talked about Bill Gates some years ago, people would kind of like, yeah, he's probably not that powerful or whatever. He's not really that influential. And now people are starting more aware of that. One thing that I think is kind of hilarious and sad at the same time is how many people I know that I've gotten conversation with about vaccines, and they're like, no, nothing's wrong with them. No, the chances of anything happening are slim or whatever. And now, like, so when they're pediatricians poking their child, they're A-okay with it. But now it's their turn to get a vaccine. You're like, screw that vaccine. I'm not getting that COVID-19 vaccine. But really, so you're okay with poking your kid? Now that it's your turn, you're all of a sudden being skeptical about vaccines. It's like, how selfish of thinking is that? It's at least it's planting the seed of doubt with vaccines, which I think is important.
I try to see that as a positive thing, that is us seeing the shift in opinion, the Orwellian, I'm blanking on it, the window, I'm blanking on the name of it, the acceptable realm of discussion, and it's fluctuating. People are suddenly seeing these things. At least that's what I'm going to hope, but the fact that you make a good point that suddenly it's not okay for them, but think of all the information they're now seeing and the differences in them then versus now. And I'm not I've always said the intent behind vaccines is very suspect to me, and not that the science is not necessarily there, but think about the fact that it's an RNA vaccine. It's never been used or tested on people before this. They failed every single time up until now. I mean, there's any number of reasons, including the intent, that we should be doubtful here, but maybe it's a good thing that they're seeing that.
Well, I think the whole RNA vaccine, DNA vaccine push now, like these experimental type of vaccines, is part of why a lot more people that may not have been skeptical before are skeptical now, because it's like clearly unproven, untested technology. They've tried to make vaccines for different diseases, and like Ryan said, they were unable to for a variety of reasons. Moderna just had, got sort of caught in this, like, they published positive interim results in a study that were totally fudge. And then there was like, basically it was this, pump and dump sort of stock selling scheme on behalf of its executives, some of whom, some of their biggest, stockholders, and one of the guys that founded the company, Bob Langer, has direct ties to Bill Gates. And sorry, I just got word that Ghislaine Maxwell will be released on bail. So man. I was right.
So that means she's going to stay in Israel then? So she gets to stay where she is? Does that work? Right?
Well, that's where she really is. Right? But I don't know. I mean, this is what I was saying, right? I didn't hear a lot of other people that were talking about Epstein convinced that she was going to get on bail. But, I don't like being right about these things. But when you look at the cases like a whole, right? I mean, it is just like the most corrupt thing ever. The judge, White House deputy counsel for Barack Obama. I mean, it's just kind of like, what do you guys expect? You know what I mean? It's just really sad. But, Ghislaine Maxwell, they're going to memory hole this now until she goes to trial, which probably won't happen. So sorry to interrupt, but that's kind of a,
No, yeah, that's huge. What do you think is going to happen, Whitney? What do you think will be between then and now?
Well, I think they'll just keep doing these, salacious stories popping up being like, she's doing this, she has this tape of this person and whatever, I mean, she'll just slip under the radar, or they're going to have some other story that'll just make this, this is all about memory holing the case, right? So whatever's in better service of that is what will happen. And they'll just, keep it going until her trial is supposed to start next July, which is forever from now. I mean, so much is going to happen between now and then. I mean, the U.S. will probably get in a giant war, before then, and then there's not going to be any trial for Ghislaine Maxwell, right?
Man.
Yeah.
Or even just a massive pandemic, or any number of these things that could shut down the country, and it'll just be, well, it's just on pause. It's just, we're going to get to it, but give us a minute. That's what it always happens. Then slowly forget. God, so depressing.
So I heard.
Yeah, but I'm telling you. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead, Ricky.
She could get up to 35 years, right? Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. But remember, this trial is supposed to happen July of next year, and that's when it's supposed to start, right? They're gonna have to do jury selection. There's gonna be the trial itself, and then there's gonna be sentencing. So, I mean, this is like way down the line, and, just because of the distance between now and then, I mean, there's so much they can do in that period of time. You know what I mean? To like just totally memory hole this. And, I think, as I said earlier, the reason they couldn't memory hole Epstein last year, right, was because people kept asking, well, where's Ghislaine Maxwell, right? And so now they have her, and now she's awaiting trial, right? But she could end up being anywhere, and they'll be like, well, she was so wily and crafty, she got away, and we don't know where she is now. I mean, all of that stuff could happen, or, the fact that it's really unlikely that this, anyone will pay attention to the trial if major geopolitical things explode over the course of the next year, which is like really possible, I mean, I just think it's hugely disappointing and really shows, I think, right, that Ghislaine Maxwell was much higher up in the pecking order than Epstein was in terms of the intelligence operation that they were both a part of in terms of sexual blackmail. Remember that her dad was basically Israel's super spy. His funeral was attended by 6 current and former heads of Israeli intelligence, numerous heads of state. His eulogy was given by Israel's then prime minister, who says Robert Maxwell did more for Israel than can be said at the service, right? So she's like, essentially like, Israeli operative royalty in that sense. Of course, they also have ties. Robert Maxwell also had ties to an extent to Russian intelligence, to MI6 in England. And also there were some, tie-overs with Iran, Contra, and the CIA and all of that stuff, right? So, that family, they are all intelligence operatives. Well, there's 7 siblings. There's 2 of them that aren't really involved, but there's 5 that definitely have, ties to this stuff, right? For sure. So, I think it just shows that they're not going to put one of the more important people in prison, right? Just like how Trump campaigned on locking up Hillary Clinton, and then he was like, well, now that I'm in office, I don't really think that needs to happen anymore. You know what I mean? I mean, they're just going through the motions, and the prosecution was bringing up all this stuff about how bad Ghislaine Maxwell is, which is true, but they're technically irrelevant to the charges she's facing, right? So they don't technically legally factor in to the decision to grant her bail or not. So them talking about her murky finances, how she sexually abused these girls, all of this is true, but none of the charges that she's facing have to do with her shady financial activity, and they didn't charge her for sexual assault or sexual abuse of these girls when they admit that she was engaged in the freaking indictment. Right? So there's a reason they chose not to pursue that stuff, and that's what they're talking about at this hearing to justify bail, but it's not directly relevant to the charges she's actually facing, right? So, I think it's definitely just an effort to memory hole all of this. Let's remember the Department of Justice is run by Bill Barr, who has numerous conflicts of interest with this case, right? And then you also have the fact that the prosecutor that Bill Barr was fired essentially right before Ghislaine Maxwell's arrest, people were saying that was motivated because of, it was retaliation, and Bill Barr wanted to keep them from arresting Ghislaine Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell's defense attorney opposed Jeffrey Berman's firing by Bill Barr. So, there's some weird stuff going on there. Also, her defense attorney used to work for the District of Manhattan that is prosecuting Ghislaine Maxwell. One of the lead prosecutors is the daughter of James Comey, former FBI director, and the judge is former deputy counsel for Barack Obama's White House. I mean, to me, this is just like the most, it's all about managing public perception and memory holding this case, in my opinion.
Well, here's an interesting take on that in the idea, like rather a prediction. If you paint her as talking about as kind of painting her as the good guy, or rather the victim, essentially, right? The one that was abused, and she simply, that they're painting her like that, and everything that you're laying out, and we go all the way forward after a year, and they come into this and they essentially try to paint that and make the picture. You could essentially make the argument of time served. Not that she was in prison the whole time, but she had to go through this the whole time. And it turns out that she was just a victim herself. And then suddenly you could argue.
She'll make a deal, right?
Right. That's what I mean.
No sentence.
It's kind of a deal for a time. Time served. And then guess what the Q crowd will say? Oh, it's because she sung and she gave him all the good information. And now Trump's going to deal with it, but it won't happen right away. Right. So it all kind of ties together, and they're going to pretend like it got done. Trump will say, I got Maxwell. He's fighting the pedophiles. Just a prediction. I mean, it's just weird because I thought of that going, wait a minute. If she's the victim, what if she goes through all of this till next year? They could go, whoa, then that was unnecessary. So that's time served. It's just this is how these work. And with you painting all these people involved, I'm not hopeful.
Well, let's also look at the history of how people caught doing espionage activity on Israel's behalf in the United States have historically been treated. Almost always, except in the case of Jonathan Pollard, who I'll get to in a second, their cases against them have been dropped. Like the numerous espionage cases involving AIPAC, right? The charges against the AIPAC officials that were involved in espionage, passing sensitive U.S. information to Israel, dropped. The U.S. official at the time who was involved in passing that classified information, one of them anyway, that was passing classified information to AIPAC that then went to Israel, is now Trump's ambassador to Turkey. That's the kind of stuff that happens with these people, right? And then you have AIPAC had another espionage scandal in the 1980s, so did the Anti-Defamation League. The charges against them, the probes into them, both got shut down. This stuff, things don't really happen to these people. Right, except for Jonathan Pollard, because, right, another good example. You had Michael Chertoff, whose mother worked for Mossad as number 2 in the Justice Department after 9/11, and he sent a bunch of, 200 and something Israeli citizens arrested in the aftermath of 9/11, all sent home, right? Then you also have, to bring up Jonathan Pollard really quick, he was the only one that's actually served prison time. And there were major efforts, including blackmail efforts of Bill Clinton by Israel to get him pardoned. And that was only blocked by CIA Director George Tenet at the time, said he would resign if that happened. Just because if you know anything about what Jonathan Pollard did, he's considered to be the most damaging spy in U.S. history by a significant degree, right? But anyway, he gets out of prison and his sentence was reduced, right? I think he only ended up serving 30 years when it was supposed to be way longer. But he gets out, and then he immediately gets a major lucrative investment banking job. He's not an investment banker. He used to be a naval military analyst, right? He gets, he has an accounts full of millions waiting for him. They name a residential building after him in Israel. He's a town square named after him in Israel. He has all this, he had accounts full of millions of dollars waiting for him. Oh, okay. Bail was actually denied. That was not,
Okay.
inaccurate report that I was shown the first time. Yeah.
The fog of
well,
breaking
that's
news,
embarrassing.
they say. Oh, it happened. The fog of breaking news,
Yeah.
right? Somebody...
Well, the good thing is I'm not live streaming.
Yikes. Well, maybe you want to cut that out. Whoops.
No, people are used to me getting facts and things wrong all the time, so it kind of goes with the theme of the show.
Right.
So what actually happened?
No, denied bail is what it says. Let me check really quick. Well, I mean, if that's the case, it's going to be, she's going to get eaten alive by COVID or Epstein between now and a year, right?
Well, at least that makes it more ridiculous, right? I mean, if she gets COVID or she gets suicided, this country is gonna boil over, right? I mean, if another Epstein scenario happens in the exact same way, that's just out of control. I mean, I think people will literally be marching through the streets if that happens.
That's a great way out of it too, right? If you wanted to kind of get out of jail, say you have coronavirus, go to a hospital, accident, kind of hide I'd say that you died, and then next thing you know, you're who knows where.
That's the key prediction, I think. There was that article that came out that I'm pretty sure, and I'm damn near sure it proved that there was the Boris Johnson article from BBC that came out that said Boris has been moved, critical for COVID, moved to somewhere which had happened before, and that was used to make it say that Ghislaine Maxwell was moved. And they said July 11th on it. And this was before the July 11th. So everyone's going, they're trying to show us what's going to happen. And, maybe, who knows? But I thought that was just a cue manipulation, but we'll see. Maybe it'll be the first one that actually comes true.
Well, Epstein got arrested last year in July, right? So it's like they were pretty close.
Right.
And yeah, the whole thing.
Almost a year to the day. Yeah.
Yeah, which was interesting. Yeah, and it was funny because I went to New Hampshire the day after she got arrested for 4th of July. Because things are actually somewhat normal up there. Nobody's wearing masks unless you're an employee. People are just walking into places with no masks or whatnot. And it felt good. It felt like normal for a little bit. But, unfortunately, I think that the longer they can continue doing this, eventually wearing a mask is going to feel normal, because the longer we keep doing it, that becomes the new normal, Like you said, I think there's some psychological tricks going on right now where just like, as long as if you can prolong a world without masks long enough, eventually a world with masks is going to feel just normal, So I think that's going to be a huge issue. But yeah, this I just don't. Do you think she'll talk? Do you think she'll give names, or do you think they'll kill her? I mean, why wouldn't she go down?
I think the FBI and the CIA and all those guys already have all the info that she could give them, right? I mean, remember, this is an intelligence operation. I really highly doubt they don't already know. I mean, there's so many people involved that people like me and other people that have investigated this have dug up, right? So how would those guys not know? You know what I mean? So, I think they might, I saw one person say that they think they might use her as the new Russiagate sort of pushing out Ghislaine names this person as being involved, someone that may not be going along with the agenda, for example, or something like that. And then, there's pressure on them. Are they a pedo? All this stuff. Things like that could definitely happen. I mean, we have to keep in mind that this woman is a spy, technically. I mean, she's an asset of intelligence. So why would she not continue to serve that if she could use it for self-preservation while, in prison?
That's a really interesting take to think about, a Red Scare, again, but this time you've got the person on the hook and she's pointing fingers. And you're right. You just pick out the people that are, resisting, as it were. That's interesting, and that would really work. Because look at how much one comment goes out of control between the two-party paradigm. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, remember the 2001 anthrax attacks? Who were the senators that got anthrax letters in the mail? The ones that were opposing the passage of the Patriot Act without debate, right? And then they get anthrax letters in the mail. So why would that, they not repeat that same tactic, being well, you're in the way. It looks like Ghislaine Maxwell may have named you. And then, they go along with the agenda or whatever. And then it's Ghislaine's well, I didn't actually have proof of that. I lied. Something like that. I mean, it could totally happen. And I think that's an interesting, analysis worth sharing. By the way, that's from Scott Cretan. Is the guy that I saw that from. But I think it's, an interesting take. And definitely possible going forward, because I mean, now she's definitely just going to be concerned about self-preservation, right? If this is really what's going on. So what will she do? She'll probably try and, the people that have sponsored her and protected her this whole time, she'll continue to try and serve their interests, right? Because as we know, from her father, right? If you threaten to spill the beans and not work with those guys and you're in a precarious situation, they'll just take you out. That's what happened with her dad. And so she's very aware of that. I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell herself has said on numerous occasions that her dad was killed by a rogue group of Mossad agents.
So do you think that Epstein, because of what happened to Epstein, it kind of put her in a situation where even if she was willing to, maybe give up some information to stay out of jail or whatever, she's scared now? That's like, well, that they obviously took out Epstein. They've taken out my dad. Well, I'm going to just play along because, I'm going to
maybe they'll do the same thing they did with Epstein. I mean, people would be outraged, but I mean, they'll get away with it. Everything's on lockdown. People are just like rolling over for this technocratic fascist rollout, Right. So, Ghislaine Maxwell gets killed off. I mean, they know with the current climate, they can get away with it. What are people going to do? Right.
And regardless how obvious it is, I mean, you look at like the most skeptical people were all on board with the idea that there's definitely a conspiracy with Epstein's death. Like the most skeptical people. I mean, people were hashtagging it. I mean, it became like a joke where, at the end of interviews, people would say, like Epstein didn't kill himself. It was like so obvious that nothing happened. Like you said, like nobody.
But what came out of that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nothing.
It became a meme. Okay, but how did that change anything? No. I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it going either way, though. I definitely agree, Whitney. I definitely think that the control that they're building makes it easier in some regard, but I think it could go either way. I mean, right now, people are so on edge. I argue that's because of whatever this whole push is some kind of end game. I just can't see it any other way. And I think that they're desperate to make sure it goes in and a little bit kind of pushing it. They're going a little too fast. They're boiling it a little too hard, right? The boiling frog, right? They got to turn it up a little slower. That's what I kind of see. But ultimately, this could push that over the edge. I mean, if we have another Epstein kind of thing, people are already going, no, I'm not wearing my mask. This is crazy. Like even like JP's one of the videos he did where people who are going along with this are going like, really? Like, man, this is out of control, but I'm scared, and all of a sudden you get one more Epstein and people are just going to go, okay, that's it. I mean, I hope for that, to be honest, if that does happen, because whether or not they can co-opt another movement marching through the streets does draw attention at the very least, but I'm not hopeful with this whole thing at all. And I think the way I look at it, to your question, Ricky, that Maxwell is probably really afraid right now, even if she thinks she's on their team, even if she thinks she's going along with the agenda and she allowed herself to get taken. How can you not be concerned? Like Whitney said, she knows they took out her father. So even when she's in the game, she's thinking, well, I'm just expendable like anybody else, so she'd probably be willing to do anything at this point to not be killed like anybody. Self-preservation.
Yeah. And I think the thing that worries me is even if she did have some mysterious death or whatnot, like you said, eventually it would just be a meme and it'd be like, oh, how crazy was that story? And that's the end of it. But what it really should do, it should red pill people. It should, like, if that's possible, where you have the whole world watching this whole case and one of the most, you look at that when Epstein was arrested, you had every news station talking about it. You had all this attention on it. And even that didn't prevent them from pulling something like that off. I mean, right. that what the hell isn't possible? It really should make people rethink a lot of things, and yet so many people just kind of go back to their normal habits of just, I mean, it's like, even if you could prove without a shadow of a doubt, like, okay, there's a conspiracy here, there's some corrupt elites or whatnot, people will still put on their Fox News or put on their MSNBC or CNN, and 2 seconds later they're talking about politics, and it's just like, it's all a fucking illusion. Like, that's like arguing about pro wrestling. Like, yeah, HBK and Triple H don't like each other, but you do know they go out to eat after they wrestle, right? Like, they're friends, they'll do business together. Like, it's the same thing. Like, you're talking about the storylines that are designed just to kind of get you caught up in these storylines. It's a soap opera. And so many times I'll be somewhere and people will assume because I do the show that I'm keeping up with every little political thing. Like, oh, did you hear what Pelosi said? And I'm like, no, because it's not important. I'm like, it just go no, it's like those little storylines aren't important. It's all because the truth is, like, behind the scenes, for the most part, we don't know what's going on and what their true intentions are, or who are really pulling the strings, or maybe they're pushing for something or not pushing for something, or doing business with somebody or not doing business with somebody. A lot of times there's all those things going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of. I mean, when House of Cards came out, Kevin Spacey, who, I mean, obviously isn't the most credible person, but and also linked to Epstein, but during an interview, because he talked to they had a lot of political insiders and people helping with the script. They asked her, like, well, what was the most unrealistic part of the storyline? And he said it was how fast they passed some, like, education bill or something like that. He's like, everything else was pretty influenced by insiders' stories of what happens in politics and how it's played. And so it's like, that kind of gives you a little, behind the scenes look of, like, hey, you know what, like, all this stuff is just, it's illusion. It's all, like, when the cameras are on, they're actors, and any politician that becomes a politician, I mean, same thing with, like you said, with Fauci, anybody who's been in government long enough, I mean, you have to be able to play that game, and that's the game of taking money from people, being able to lie, cheat, steal, and every once in a while you do get somebody like a Ron Paul who has been very consistent. Seems like he has true ideas that he's passionate about, and I think people like that. And even with the last election, I think why people on the Sanders side and people on the Trump side had so much in common, even though obviously the two candidates were completely different with ideas, or in Trump's perspective, I guess from Trump's perspective, lack of ideas, because I don't know if he really does believe in any ideologies or has any real philosophies on the world besides just money and power. But it was the fact that people just wanted something different, and that kind of helped a little bit was the fact that it seemed like people understood that, okay, this is just a game. It's an illusion. I'm not going to fall for it anymore. I'm not going to just pretend this guy with a suit and tie who looks just like that other guy with a suit and tie who's all saying the same thing. Like, I'm not going to pretend like this is real. And I remember going back and looking at, like, old debates with, like, Nixon and Kennedy and they're basically saying the same shit they were saying now. Like, it's always about, like, the middle class and helping the little guy and Main Street, instead of Wall Street and all. Like, they've been saying the same lines forever and ever. So when Trump was going up there and saying something, throwing curveballs, and honestly, if he actually did some of the things that he seemed like he was gonna, he stood for when he was, running, he was against the TPP, he was against, he was questioning vaccines, in one of the debates. He was all these things, and then once he became president, I mean, it either tells you that either one, they're all great liars and he was the best of all of them, or two, once you become president, you really don't have any pull on what's going on, because our policy hasn't changed. A lot of you want to jump in, Whitney?
Oh, I was just going to say both can be true, right?
That's true also,
They can both be great liars and then have no pull once they're there, right? So, I mean, I think it really depends on the individual. But, I definitely don't think, Trump, I mean, if you look at Trump's history, right, who he was before he was a campaign, on the 2015 campaign trail, I mean, I think it was mostly rhetoric, right, to a large degree. I mean, he used to be chummy with the Clintons. There's pictures of them laughing together at his wedding, right? I mean, it's all one big club, right? Anyway, though, with that being said, I kind of have to run now because I have another thing to get into. So thanks a lot, Ricky, and yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, I was just going to add real quick, Ricky, just the idea of the focus groups thing that you were talking about, just this idea that focus groups are how they run politics today. These people don't believe what they're running with. They don't. Ron Paul believes those things today. Bye, Whitney. they run on focus groups. That's all I was going to say. Just now that she left out, I was just finishing saying the idea that they run based on things they know will get them elected. Right? They have people they pay to collect information, and they put it together and they go, okay, this is what the people want to hear. Right? That's what they do. They want to hear end the Fed, lock up Hillary Clinton. They're not going to actually do those things. right? So think about what that means when you're voting for a politician, right? You're voting for the things that they think you want to hear, not the things they actually believe in. It's pretty depressing when you think about it.
Well, a perfect example is the speeches, right? Like people will be like, "Oh, how great did he sound in that speech?" It's like, but yet we all know they have speechwriters. Like and we don't know how much influence they have on what's in that speech. And every line and the way things are said, what's not said, certain words that are used, like all this is analyzed, and it's a well thought out plan to manipulate you, and for lack of a better word, like to give you the illusion that they're for you, they're on your team, and that's what they're trying to do. And like you said, that's why it's so important for people to be able to kind of cut through that. And it's like, listen, these people are their job is try to get your vote, and that's whatever it takes. And that's what it's all about. It's all about trying to get your vote. I mean, the second I've had Jack Abramoff on, and which it was an interesting conversation to say the least. But he exposed a lot of the lobbying thing, even though he was a part of the problem. He after he did some time, coincidentally, only after he did some time did he see the light and want to expose it. Right. But he, but if you look at his story, I mean, it was quite obvious that he could influence anybody, Republicans, Democrats, whatever it was, and the language that was in these bills, a lot of times they wouldn't even know what language they're voting for because some lobbyist said, hey, put this in there, put that in there, look at some of the relief funds that just kind of got thrown away. What was the Green New Deal? Some of that stuff got thrown in the bills and stuff like that. I mean, they all have other interests. So it really is just a huge illusion. That's why I love shows like yours that really focus on these bigger issues, because some people get really caught up in the political rhetoric and watching this news cycle and people who watch Fox News now think like, hey, see, all these years we told you that Fox News was giving you the truth and whatnot. It's like, well, if this was during the Iraq War, I'd be maybe arguing with you a little more. But it's all about politics, right? So it's like if Fox News is trying to bash one side, and then they might say something that's accurate and might make sense. Obviously, the Trump side is kind of more for opening up the country or whatnot. So right now they seem like they're not the ones trying to give you fake news. But if the roles were reversed, if Trump was for the lockdown, they'd be pushing that narrative.
Right,
so
right. Well, what's interesting though with the Fox thing, I'm actually seeing a lot, and this is why I'm seeing a lot of markers like this that are making me feel this is like an end game of sorts, that they're doing things like, for instance, Fox News is going full blow in the other direction right now. I know numerous hardcore Trump supporters, diehard Fox watchers that are suddenly like, Fox is sold out, completely off the board, like Fox is gone, right? And it's because they're saying you got to wear masks, you got to get your vaccines, and these are things that these Trump supporters thought. Yeah, I mean, there's some things. I think Tucker has a little bit different opinion. I don't really watch that much mainstream media. I'm just getting this from other Trump supporters and Fox viewers. As I do the same thing on the other side. I like to see what they think when they're in that, But it's interesting to see that, and they are very, in a lot of ways. It's very, I would say, based on what I'm hearing, the vast majority of Fox right now is leaning into the idea that masks are needed. This will continue until you get a vaccine. You know what I mean? And that's just really interesting. But either way, the point is the same. That the media is ultimately trying to just get you into a certain mindset for the reasons they've already predetermined. And the politicians or the lobbyist groups, like Rand Paul, interestingly, on the other side of the Pauls, he recently, remember he did this on a Twitter thing. He showed a bill that was like this thick. He's like, see this? He's like, I got this last night. Right. And we're voting on this today. He's like, how, the point is nobody reads these things. And it's like, that's so crazy. It's because they know, well, this is what you guys want. You're paying me. OK, I'll sign my name to it. That's what politicians are today. That's why back in, it's funny enough, there's an interesting comment on my show the other day where somebody said, I was talking about Dr. Jensen, the one who's is a Republican.
Scott Jensen. Yeah.
Yes. But he's a doctor as well as a politician. And the guy was going, oh, you can't be both. And I'm thinking, well, actually, that's what it used to be. There was a public service. You were whatever, and then you're helping your country by being a politician on your off time. Now that's the career as the politician. And that needs to show us something, Yeah.
Jesse Ventura talked about that too. How it used to be like just like you said, you were just serving your country, the people, but you'd always go back to the private sector or wherever you were working before.
Because it didn't really get paid that well.
Yeah.
It was moderate. Like it was just a little bit, because it was really, you had to go back and be a farmer because that's how you paid your bills. You know,
and you're very courageous for reading comments, because when you're on YouTube, that could be a rabbit hole among itself that you might regret going down.
Yeah, no, it can be rough. There's a lot of people that are just simply so completely lost in this that just want, they're attacking you because you're saying something without even looking into it, which is why it's so important. And this is what, I mean, I'm sure this show made it apparent to people that might have already seen it. It's so important to look for people like Whitney Webb, or the people out there that are just like day in and day out, like deep researching this stuff. I mean, I'm an aggregator, I mean, I do a lot of research myself, but by and large, it's reading into people like Whitney Webb or people like any number of people I could list off, and bringing that together. So we got to tip our hats to people like that, and that's what we need to be looking for, not Fox News or CNN or even commentators for the most part. I mean, you should be seeking out and finding the core source material, looking at it for yourself. Half people out there going, "Oh God, I have no time for that." And it's like, well, that's okay. That's a choice then. You're choosing to keep your head in the sand, right? That's a choice about time or not.
Yeah, well, time used to be the issue. Now the issue is censorship. Like, how do you, even if you do find, if you say, hey, I'm going to make the time to really dig deep into this issue, really get all perspectives or whatnot, that's why I've been doing these shows, these swap casts with alternative media people, and trying to get people from the community together and try to figure out solutions. And because it's, regardless where you stand or what your perspective is or what research you're focused on, if people can't reach it, it's in some sense it's pointless, and that's why it's so bothersome when you see like that documentary Plandemic, the fact that it didn't matter if you agreed with everything that was in there or not. It didn't matter if there's holes in some of the stories or things that didn't make sense. The biggest problem was the fact that it was pulled in, and it was it was such a collaborated effort to pull this thing, make sure nobody watched it, even though it was going viral, and pull it. And yet you could watch it as long as somebody was debunking it. You could go on YouTube and you could find clips of the video as long. So it's like, it's completely okay. It's the documentary's not so dangerous to watch if somebody's debunking it or calling it a hoax, because what they're doing is they're already having an influence on your perspective on what you're watching. But for you to watch it completely on your own and decide by yourself, that's dangerous. And
that's a great point, because many of those people actually played like the whole documentary. They would stop it and talk about it, but they played the whole thing through. So you're right. I mean, that's an incredible point, that that they are okay with it as long as they're the one framing the information for you. That's propaganda.
Yeah. And what does that tell you? And so it's like, it wasn't that the documentary itself was so dangerous they didn't want you to watch it, which alone I have a problem with, because it's like, if somebody wants to make a documentary on flat earth or make a documentary on Holocaust denying, like whatever it may be, I'm okay with that. Like, put together the information. If you truly believe this, people should have the right to look at it, watch it, see your research. And if we think it's nonsense, then we'll just say it's nonsense. We move on to the next thing. But to say that you're deciding for us what information is valid or not valid, or what perspective we should be able to see or not see. And then the fact that her Wikipedia page got locked. When Ben Swan was on, when we did that whole alternative media Zoom, whatever, hangout, I have to find a smaller title for what I call that, but that Swapcast. I just keep adding things like the hangout, Swapcast, Zoom. But when he was on there, we talked about that, because similar thing happened to him, like where when he got basically, his Wikipedia page got locked and all this stuff. And when they come together and they do that and they decide to attack you like that, I mean, that's crazy to think about. I mean, they were discrediting this person, and people are like, well, she had a book that was coming out. You hear stuff like that, and I'm just like, well, like, she's been writing books for a while. She's been in the alternative media world for a while. It just happened that this documentary really picked up some steam and went viral, and really, it red pilled a lot of people. But then it also I remember talking to a lot of people who were like, oh, it's already been debunked. It's like, wait, it's been viral for 24 hours. How could it be debunked already? Like, you couldn't in 24 hours do enough research to decide for yourself it was all BS or not. Like, that's just ridiculous. And how come you can't see the documentary, but yet you can read all these articles that are being posted about how it's BS and it's not true or whatever, even though there's a lot of other doctors that are saying similar things. And the other thing that's really interesting to me about doctors and scientists' perspectives and opinions is, I think I was talking to Corbett about this, was how you can go to another doctor and get a second opinion. I mean, the term second opinion exists because we understand not all people with PhDs and or have the same opinion. So what does that tell you? Like, yeah. So if you have a doctor that says, hey, this is how I feel about the coronavirus, it doesn't mean it's like, God speaking. It doesn't mean that it's truth with a capital T. There could be another doctor with a different opinion, because all they're doing is analyzing information, and everybody could have different information, different sources, and then come up with a perspective, a opinion based on that information. So we agree when we have some medical issue that not all doctors agree, and you can get a second opinion, and you get a second opinion because a doctor could have a different perspective on your issue. But yeah, when it came down to coronavirus, it's like we decide, like, no, any doctor that says this, he's right. All the other ones are pseudoscience. It was ridiculous.
Well, it's an incredibly it's disconnected from what we've been doing before, right? I mean, at the end of the day, and which you're making clear there, I mean, they are saying that it applies over here this way and it applies over here this way, and they're completely different things, right? We can't look at this thing and pretend like it's, I mean, it applies, the whole situation is like this. Whether we're talking about masks, whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about any part of this whole story, the goalpost has moved for the entire discussion to where now, and your point is the best way to look at it, that your doctor is telling you something. He went to school, he is educated, he's a quote unquote expert, but he can also be wrong, right? So before, besides, getting a second opinion or informed consent and allowing it to be your choice based on the doctor's opinion, not that the doctor gives you a mandate and you have to follow it, right? Now, suddenly that's where we are. And now all of a sudden, people who are experts, Nobel laureates, people who are, the most widely respected doctor in Bulgaria suddenly are conspiracy theorists because they're daring to at least not even say, I disagree, but saying, here's information. Right? Like, this is something that's real. Now, you can come to your own conclusion, and that's being deleted. Like, there's no way you can misunderstand this. It's become a cult. It's become gospel. Like, this is the truth because government says so. Not experts, but governments. And then that government trots out their paid experts, right? So we can trot out ours too, right? But we're not allowed to see those ones. It's just this very clear, cultivated experience. And I think it's at the very least. And I'll actually, jumping back to a point that you made before, and the Maxwell thing popped up in regard to the testing, right? The only point I'm trying to make on all this stuff, mass or testing, is that you have a right to know all of it and to come to your own conclusions. The point you were making about the video, right? And the idea is that the testing, we know as a matter of fact that the CDC has admitted on their website that they are conflating antibody tests with viral tests. You have antibodies if you've ever had the virus. So you could have had it a year ago, and you're going to test positive for COVID today. That counts as a case, right? We also know that they're openly stating that they're going to increase the idea of the probable cases. Collin County was a big point of this. You have a headache, you have a fever, and you're in Collin County. You're now a probable case. That gets counted without research. And if you die, well, that gets counted as a death for COVID. Now, the point here is not to say that everything's fake, but we all have to be able to look at that and go, okay, we know the numbers aren't accurate. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 50. The point is we know as a matter of fact that they're not accurate, and yet they're still using those numbers to remove things from us, to put you on lockdown, to put your business. I mean, just think about how unreal that is, and then when we point to that and I say, here's a study that says one thing, I'm not even giving you my take on it. I'm spreading misinformation somehow. Wait a minute, that's from the NIH website. That's from the CDC. Now you're fake news. It's irrational.
And you've been in the restaurant business, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm. I was up until I started this for the most part. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, how awful this whole situation is for the restaurant industry. Like how
death sentence.
Yeah. I mean, it's a death sentence. Like the restaurants, it's already one of the hardest industries ever. Like, I forget what percentage of restaurants fail within like the first year or 6 months.
I could tell you right now, when I was getting out of culinary school, it was something like 1 out of every 8 or 10. When I was in the field, and this was when there was a big dip in the economy and all this different stuff. It was like, basically the majority, 3 out of 4, something like that. And It's just outrageous to think about because you're and that fluctuates over time. That's just the ones I can remember. But that is very it's most people don't realize how hard it is to actually make money in a restaurant, right? And this is the thing, even about fine dining restaurants, let's say. People may not be familiar with names, but people like Thomas Keller, they have some of the #1 restaurants in the world in Napa Valley, or a better one, Wolfgang Puck, let's say. He's got any number of wildly fine dining restaurants. You know where he makes the vast majority of his money? From Wolfgang Puck Express. All the other ones are his flagships. He actually, if you look this stuff up, he probably loses money on almost every one of them, and he's doing it because it's art. He's making his money on the tinfoil plates with your silverware, right? I mean, that's where he's making the real money. So we realize that these restaurants, you're given Chili's and, your middle of the rung restaurants, they are barely making money every single day. And they just, over time, they make profit. But if you put a stick in the spokes like this, it's a guaranteed death sentence. I mean, we are going to see the absence of independent restaurants. It's going to be corporate entities. That's all we're going to get moving forward, whether that's gyms or restaurants or pretty much any variant of. You ask any economist about this whole situation, or any people that are paying attention, right now, all of the big business is scooping up all of the excess market in every single field. That's why we gave all of our money to the big business, right? You know how we would have saved the economy? To take all the money they took from us and give it to Americans, instead of giving millions of dollars to Boeing so they can lay off 7,000 employees. Right? That is a guaranteed way to make sure the economy doesn't work, because we're the economy, not the big business. They would have been just fine. Yeah, they would have lost a lot of money, but they would have been just fine, right? They guaranteed that we would be in this position. Every step of the way, there's been choices, and we just can't see past it because of the two-party paradigm. No, it's Biden. No, it's Trump. No, it's all of them, and we can't see that, and it's going to keep going. It's frustrating.
Yeah. When big corporations like Boeing, public corporations, when they're struggling, it means that they have to sell one of their yachts. It's like, it's when a local restaurant's struggling, it means like they could lose their business, they could lose their house, they could lose.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's much more significant of an impact on their lives, and I think people don't realize that. Like, oh, these companies, and a lot of times when you look back at their history, you're like, well, you know what, they've been struggling and they've made some bad decisions in the past. It wasn't specifically because of this one issue. Where that's the part that's bothersome, is that there's a lot of restaurants and a lot of just businesses in general that could be doing everything right, and now because of these restrictions, because the room for error is so little, and like you said, the profit margin is so little, that this is all they needed to go out of business. And you hear some people talk about, oh well, if you were only making this amount of profit or this amount of money or whatever, if your profit margin was so little, then maybe you weren't running a good business in the first place. Well, that's not necessarily true, because in the restaurant business and like things like construction or whatever, like there's so much competition with small businesses fighting against big businesses, that you needed to keep your costs low. You have to have a very small profit margin, which means your room for error is very little, and then one little thing like this, a little hiccup in the way the business is being run, and next thing you know, you're out of business and you're struggling, and then the worst part is that there's going to be so many things out of business that even if your own personal business shuts down, where are you going to find work? Because there is no work. You can't even go work for other restaurants because other restaurants are going out of business. And coming from somebody so I was born in Portugal, I came to the U.S. and my parents always made like traditional Portuguese food, but I always had this appreciation for home cooked meals and recipes that came from other countries, and they make food the way that they eat it there. It's not somebody's interpretation of it, but it's these old recipes. I mean, I remember my wife asking my mother, like, oh, how do you what's your recipe for this? And she's like, oh, a little bit of that or a little bit, and it's like, and I remember telling my wife, I'm like, listen, you have to watch her, because to her it's muscle memory. She's done it for so many times that it's like she doesn't measure anything. It's like a little bit of I'm like, you have to see how much she's actually putting in, because she doesn't even know. If she had to write it down, she probably couldn't, and but to lose that, and that everything's going to be big corporations and that are going to use the cheap. And the thing about big corporations is that they care about profit. And that means that if they can cut corners by using some cheap chicken or some cheap whatever food or whatever quality stuff, that's what they're going to do. And they're all going to look the same. And I'm sure, as you know, like sometimes the best food is these little mom and pop, most cases, like these little mom and pop places. It's like, might not look the best, might not, but great food, and they care about the quality. The owners are actually there, unlike a Olive Garden where the chef has a neck tattoo and just got out of prison. It's
also just cook. who's not a chef, right? I mean, that's a real thing. Like if you're just a cook, you haven't been trained, and you know what I mean. But it's definitely you're very, very right, and it's very frustrating to see the demolishing of small business. And think of what do those big corporations do? They're the ones that make deals with bad companies and make deals to use GMO foods and low quality products. Yes, because profit is the only thing that matters. And that's kind of neither here nor there, right? That's the system they're in. How can you fault them for making profit in it's the system itself and the powerful people that have created a system that incentivizes that kind of vulture capitalism and that kind of, you know what I mean? Like that's what it is. The profit margins in restaurants and a lot of things like that are historically very small, especially for small business. But of course, when you're a big corporation, and you've got 20,000 Chili's all across this country, well, yeah, you can shave one off and you're good, right? You're a mom and pop and you got your one restaurant that you ran for 30 years. You lose this right now, you're done. You know what I mean? You're paying out of your savings for months and months. Oh, the opening up is coming. Let's keep paying. Oh, now they're shutting down again. Right. And now you just paid your savings out over the last 6 months in hopes that you're going to open again. Right. They're not taking care of these people. And this is such a clear, obvious, in my opinion, setup. Whether everyone knows that or not, the choices that were made, as I keep saying, were meant to lead to this point. Every single part of this. And now look, think about the whole who benefits question. Every part of it, no matter where you look, what does it amount to? More reliance on the government, more need for the government, assistance, help. Provide, any of it, contact tracing, even pretend like that's for us. It's all about the government invasiveness into our lives, every possible spot.
And it's funny. Well, you couldn't have predicted this besides Event 201. And they did predict this. Right. They talked about it. I mean, they
literally predicted it.
They literally predicted this. When people say I'm like, event, I mean, they literally had fake. I mean, did you see the videos? Like they had fake news reporters, sounding like the news reporters today. It's doing the same thing. It's like, so you couldn't just say, well, this got everybody off guard or nobody saw it coming or, it's the same bullshit that they used during 9/11, nobody saw it coming besides that memo that said Al-Qaeda trying to, hijack planes and yeah.
Yeah, or the fact that they actually had an exercise like that on the day of 9/11, right? So, or the fact that they had, like James Corbett points out, that they had at least, I don't want to misquote it because I haven't watched it in a while, but I mean, I think 5, 6 other exercises leading up to this of planes flying into buildings, and I think 2 of which were actually planes flying into the World Trade Center. So the idea that, and maybe you could say Bush is just that stupid and just didn't know. And he said, who would have thought planes flying into buildings? But then you got Condoleezza Rice saying the same thing. They knew about this stuff. Right. And what's even crazier is that we can look back now and actually prove that she knew about those studies. So why did she lie about it right then? Oh, well, no one's ever going to ask that question outside of the independent media. And if you ask that question from the sidelines, you conspiracy theorist, right? Even though it's like, wait a minute, didn't we just prove it? This is the rigmarole of the mainstream media control. Now think about that times 1,000 with the technocratic surveillance network. You know what I mean? And the AI systems, and they're monitoring everything you're doing. And that's what they're building around you right now. This just one step further in that direction.
Well, have you checked your phone? Because all phones, my wife has a Apple and I have an Android, a Pixel, and you can go in there and you already have it downloaded. The contact tracing software is already in there. Like you go to settings and you go into health or something like that, and then. Yeah, and it's there, and they're like, oh, well, people would find it, and they're like, oh, but it's not on. I'm like, well, if they can download it without you knowing, don't you think they can turn it on without you knowing? I'm like, so it's how scary is that? It's like all this contact tracing thing. It's like it sounds like a conspiracy theory, and then all of a sudden it's like it's happening and it's real, and it's like we've never contact traced people who had the flu, and guess what? That kills kids all the fucking time. Why aren't we checking the fevers of teachers during the H1N1 virus? That actually was putting kids in danger, and yet no big deal. And most people don't even know what year it was when the H1N1 flu. It didn't affect anybody's life at all for the most part. And yet, now, something, and like you said, based on false numbers, false tests, a virus that is so, I forget who said it. I think it was Alex Crane or one of my past guests. I saw it on his Facebook page where he's like, this virus is so deadly and dangerous that you need to be tested to know if you even have it. It's like, it's like, that's a really good point. It's like, it's true. It's like, it's so deadly, but yet, and then, the asymptomatic people, it's like, well, we got to worry about them because they could be spreading. Oh, come to find out that now we don't have to worry about asymptomatic people. Maybe they're not spreading it. It's like, how many times to go back and forth? And the thing is, like, if you confuse people enough, then eventually people just throw their hands up and they're like, you know what? I don't know. I'm just going to wear this mask anyways. And that's what's happening, right?
That's the fake news thing. Well, that is the 2016 scenario in a different way, right? It's almost kind of a Brave New World spin on it. Where, I mean, look, and it's one part of that. I recommend, as always, people read all these things. 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 421. They're all very relevant. But this applies to the idea that you're being so flooded with information that you just check out. It's apathy, right? Take your pill. Just, okay, who cares? Take your soma, just kick back, relax. Because at the end of the day, it's so clear that they're just barraging you with so much information that you don't know what to think, so you just don't care anymore. And think about the fake news is the same thing, right? We're here going, look, here's the truth. It's verified. Look at it for yourself. But they've been so tired of seeing something and then saying, oh, it's fake news. Oh, I got tricked. That they just don't care. They just sit back and maybe don't watch anything, but probably just flick on Fox because it's comfortable, or CNN. I'm here. And it's the same thing today. You're right. It's like and then you add like desperation, fear, even more so. They're going to just be like, screw it. I can't trust anybody. I'm going to wear a mask anyway. It makes sense. It's all social engineering.
It really is. And, not to bash Fox more than like CNN or MSN, because they all deserve bashing. But the thing is, like, absolutely during the lockdown, Fox was the place where I was getting or I was seeing them being more outspoken about, let's start the country up again or whatever. But what people have to remember is it just happens that their political agenda is closer to the truth that I've subscribed to. But they still have a political agenda. So in other words, like, if for some reason, like, it would hurt the Democrats or people on the left to lie about something in the other direction, they would, so it's not, in other words, like, they're not, what I'm trying to say is it's not because they have a great moral compass and that they're giving you some sense of truth or something closer to the truth because they care about you and they want to spread truth. It's because it just happens that their agenda ends up being parallel with lining. So so that's what people have to remember, because, and then when you look at, like, during the Iraq War, it's a perfect example. Actually, they all lied to you. I mean, they all were all on board. It didn't matter which one you were listening to. But it's more about defending their team than it is about giving you any sense of truth. And it's never been more obvious. I mean, CNN's hatred for Donald Trump has only helped show how obvious it is. But the problem is that then you get people on the Fox News side that says, see, I told you all along that CNN was the ones who were spreading fake news. It's like, yeah, but you know what? If it was, if it would help your agenda, if it would help your team, you'd be doing it too. I mean, there's that documentary years ago. I think it was called Foxed Out, about, like, all the memos that they would get. Yeah, and they would tell you, like, how to spin a story, things that you would leave out of the story to help kind of push the agenda. And so all that stuff happens everywhere. It's not that one of them is better than the other. Everything is a political football, and whatever helps their team, that's what they're going to say. And if it happens to be, there's be some truth to it. I mean, there's people on the right who are very much like defending their team. But if they're exposing some corruption of the Clintons, you know what? Like, there's still some good that comes out of it. So sometimes, it's not to say that CNN's hatred for Donald Trump couldn't mean that they could publish a story that had some factual, usable, good information in there. It just means that you have to take it with a grain of salt that, yeah, they also have an agenda. But you see that a lot, too, where you'll share something and be like, well, that's Fox News or that's CNN or that's whatever. It's like, well, can we just look at the facts? Yeah, exactly.
Which it gives them a scapegoat, right? They can just go, without CNN. It's like, well, you didn't even look into it. The way I see it is it's the fake resistance. It's the two-party paradigm. There doesn't mean there aren't people within this that actually believe what they're saying, or vice versa, other way. But at the end of the day, it was very quick. No one even noticed it. Where the left was the resistance. Who's the resistance now? Right? Think about it. The right is going, well, the left wants to shut it down, and we're not allowing it. We're going to resist. Right? That's always how it goes. If you look back, remember before even now, what was it before Trump? The right were the crazy evangelical extremists, remember? The left was the sane one, right? Now and it just over time it flips and it flops. So you have the bad guy and you got the resistance. It's fake resistance. All it does is allow you to ebb and flow with the politics. You think that they're changing and flow. All they're really doing is just a changing of the guard. It goes back and forth and it goes back and forth. Sometimes it's 2 and then 2. Sometimes, you know what I mean? We watch the patterns throughout the years, but all it ultimately amounts to is you thinking you're on the side of resistance and you resist just enough to make it seem like things are fighting, but nothing ever stops. The war continues, the agendas continue, right? I mean, you can look back as far as you want. The agendas barely even faltered. We get pitted into things like immigration and debating about things that should be never debated, things like this Constitution itself, fighting about the Second Amendment. It's like, why are we arguing about things that are inherent? Well, our government is literally robbing us and overthrowing countries. That's why. So we're not paying attention.
Well, that's like the whole Black Lives Matter thing. Is like a lot of people in the alternative media. We understand the history of eugenics. I mean, absolutely, there was some serious inherent racism in, like, Planned Parenthood and all this stuff. Like, but yet nobody's talking about that. We're talking about, I don't even know what the fuck people are talking about. It's like people are either anti-cop or they're anti the people who are anti-cop. It's like I don't. Neither one is right all the time. Like, there's gonna be. I'm Portuguese. Guess what? If a shithead robs a place and gets shot by a cop because he was resisting arrest and put the cops' lives in danger, then without a doubt, like, I'll say, hey, he was just a shithead. It doesn't matter that he was Portuguese. And, there's shitheads everywhere. That's my point. Like, there's going to be good cops and bad cops. There's going to be good people of every nationality, every single color or whatnot. So and the other thing, too, is that people who do have their heart in the right place, their passion for this topic is going to be used as a political weapon. And that's what's happening. And a lot of people in the alternative media is talking about this. And that's what I think a lot of times people are in the alternative media who are talking about this. They're looking at them like, oh, what are you saying? That there isn't racism? Or it's like, no. We're also the same people who talk about eugenics. And we talk about Margaret Sanger. And we talk about, this inherent racism in our system. But it doesn't mean you're also not being used. And it just the conversation is very hard to have because people don't want to have. Yeah,
it's emotional. Right. That's the whole thing we were saying earlier, right? It's about getting people to an emotional state so they're not thinking critically, to where you can go, okay, I can see your point, but I disagree. That's not going to happen, right? It's going to be you're the enemy of the people. We have to take you out because you're going to end the country, right? That has been end all be all politics. That's what this is today, and it's the same way in this. Like personally, my opinion, and I do think it's rooted in the evidence, but it's my opinion. There is very clearly a systemic problem in this country, and very clearly, predominantly in our enforcement arm, right? I mean, I think it's been cultivated over decades. I mean, look at it. It's militarized. I mean, you can very clearly show, I've gone through the statistics in a broad sense, and I very much think that look, are we going to pretend like there's not inherent racism in this country? It's decades ago. We had Jim Crow and these things that are very real. Nixon created the war on drugs, and this is documented in order to direct it at the minority population. So maybe that's exactly like it is. What's that?
Just recording. Isn't there a recording of him saying that?
Yeah, exactly. It's on tape, And you could argue.
Another thing people forget, Jim Crow is a Democrat.
Well, my point again is that there were never, it's all just a name to them, even back then, but you could argue that it's the same way now. And maybe it is. Maybe they just covered it up. Or you could argue that it's not as severe. But nobody can pretend that we don't have racism and it hasn't gone through to our systems today, right? To pretend that that's not true is just a political point from the extreme right, to pretend there's no such thing as racism, obviously. But the point is not to make it all consuming and go the other way with it, to say that, well, we need to abolish all of it. It's like, well, that's a weird point, actually, that as a anarcho-libertarian, I guess that's what I've settled on. I'm pretty broad. But I would argue there's a place to remove control structures like that. But to talk about removing it in our system today is lunacy. You know what I mean? To just say, well, let's just remove the police in the middle of this ridiculous system that's completely broken. That's what they want. It's going to make it more chaotic, So it's always about finding that middle ground. And if you're stuck on one side or the other of that two-party paradigm, you're never going to see that middle ground. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why I'm so hard. I mean, I'm harping on the two-party paradigm more than I ever have in the last, to the point where even fans of mine are going, would you please stop talking about it? I'm like, well, no, I'm not. Because in my opinion, that is the one thing. If we can see past that, the illusion, the people will finally realize that it's us, and they're the ones not listening to us. Like I made this point in regard to the whole thing. Like, and maybe it's gonna be a point we can end on because I do have to kind of rush off here in a second. Yeah. But the idea of the whole thing, we got, the pandemic and Trump, and Trump's doing this and they're doing that, Democrats versus them. How about we all just sit back and go, we as the American people are unhappy with this. We don't give an F about family friendly or not, I forget. We don't care about what you guys are talking about between each other. Get it done, right? Yeah. Oh, the Democrat, we don't care. Trump wouldn't do, we don't care, right? We want you to finish this. We don't want a lockdown. We don't want this, whatever. Like, if we can all realize that, we need to see that obviously the problem is that we are pitted so aggressively in our opinions, but we could collectively realize, for instance, that we want our economies to be allowed to open our businesses again. And if we all came together as Americans and didn't care about their back and forth, we could demand change. And all they would come to it with every time is that, okay, well, the Democrats not letting us do it. We shouldn't care about that. You see what I'm saying? Like, we need to demand that they do what we want. We don't need the ins and outs of it. I mean, technically, we should be able to. That's why I think blockchain technology should be used in that regard, so we can track everything they're doing. But the point is the same. Once we see past it, we can actually change the world, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with you. That's why these shows that, and Sam Tripoli has said it before, where like shows like yours, shows like mine, shows like Sam's, we could have a way bigger following if we're just like, hey, let's be Q guys and let's just jump on that side. Or, hey, let's be super liberal and be, anti, police officers and police brutality and not actually get to the root cause of all these issues, which, I mean, obviously, I had Rick Ross on my show. I mean, the U.S. government flew in drugs and then locked people, minorities, for using those drugs up, and then created, one parent families, which the likelihood of you getting, getting arrested or going to prison are much higher and whatnot. And the chances of those kids succeeding in life are much lower. So, I mean, all these things. I mean, look at the lead that was in New York apartments and stuff like that, right? When they got rid of all that, like the crime rate went like flying down, So like there is an issue with like poverty and these poor communities. They don't have a fair shot, and things aren't fair across the line. But what they're doing is they're dividing and conquering, and you're starting to see this rhetoric where it's like either you have to be like super pro black or super pro white, and it's like, can't we just be pro people? Like, aren't we all like on the same team? So
did you hear, Ricky? That's now racist, apparently.
What's that?
Like that's didn't you hear now? Now that statement is actually racist. No, you can't claim that we all should have right. No, you have to pick a side. Like, that's literally the case. It's like to say all lives matter is racist, apparently. You know what I mean? And you could argue that coming from a state where you're trying to do it to disparage one side, maybe.
That is the case.
Right, I do get that, right? But from a point where I'm literally saying genuinely that I think that the Black Lives Matter, or even now the argument that, we are seeing a rise of actual people online now saying, white's this or white's that versus the other side. And because that's the point. It's rising up and it's battling each other. And we should be able to stand back and be like, how about no? How about you're both wrong? And it doesn't mean there's not racism that was here and, and on and on and on, like the same rigmarole. But no, that's racist, which is fundamentally ridiculous at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't want to take up much more of your time. You probably have a delicious dinner you're going to make or something. but thanks so much, Ryan, for being with me. I think I told you that we're going to do another one of those swap casts, hangout, alternative media, long title things on the 20th. And then hopefully you and Whitney can join us. They're really fun. I'm hoping as we do more of them and people get comfortable, it becomes much more loose of a conversation. And the goal is to kind of hope that people become much more comfortable to share their thoughts and maybe having conflicting opinions. And I always love having those type of discussions as long as people are willing to not just share ideas, but let people challenge their ideas and not get defensive about it. I think is a really useful conversation.
Yeah, well, I just like to add before we go that I really do respect what you're doing a lot. And I think it's really important that people whether joining you or do their own thing, this is what needs to happen, you know? And I'll do my best to join. I just have a real tough time with the later part of my day lately. I'm an old man, apparently. I can't stay up past 6 p.m. It's important, though, you know, that we all come together, work. And I mean, even if it's not even joining the show, take the time to share the link, you know, say, look at all these people coming together. How about you check out all their channels? Open your mind a little bit and you know, to different perspectives. That's it. I mean, think about it like that. I bet you that most people aren't even aware of every single person on the screen, even though there's no reason they shouldn't be, because they're all pretty, you know, prominent reporters. It's because we get stuck in these echo chambers, and that's partly because that's the point. You know, they're not going to recommend things that will broaden your horizon. They're going to push you into those places they want you to be, you know? So just great work on that. And I'm glad to see it happening.
Thank you. And thanks for the shout out. I really appreciate that. And I think it's really important for people to realize that, like, we don't all have to agree on everything. Not everybody in the alternative media doesn't mean, hey, we all agree on these things. It means it's just an alternative perspective to the bullshit you're being shown on TV. And it's like, I love just exploring ideas. Like, to me, it's like, oh, here's a person with a different perspective than my own. Like, why? Where do they, like, what's their opinion? How do, you know, what's their facts or information that they're using to mold their opinion? Like, all this stuff. Because, and then I don't like to be married to any ideas. Like, I don't like to also think that, like, I could be wrong, but my ignorance is not letting me take in any more information. So it's like, to me, it's super important to, like, constantly reevaluate why you believe something, where you stand on something, why do you have that opinion, all those things. Too often people get defensive and they marry themselves to an idea, and they're like, well, this is the sword I'm dying on, regardless if I'm right or wrong, or if new information comes in or whatnot. So I think that it's fun. It's fun. It's the conversations that I tend to learn the most from and have the most fun having. And I'm sure similar to yourself, you know, probably some of the funnest conversations you have are people that you might slightly disagree with. So, you know, I think these are important conversations. So hopefully we can keep you up. I'll have to, like, maybe send you a coffee or something like that and try to keep you up. And hopefully you can join us for one of them. And thanks again. I did Last American Vagabond. It's a YouTube channel. It's a podcast. Is your podcast working again? I know.
Yeah. No, at this point, I mean, it's funny you ask. We really don't know exactly what's happening. I mean, it's just really odd. It seems to be all in line with everything else that's been going on with the website and whatever else. But as far as we could tell, it seems like an issue with GoDaddy. Like, it's working. The feed's there. You can even download it directly from my website, but it's just not populating. We're hosting with them still, so that's the only thing they're just like, there's a block happening somewhere between GoDaddy, and they don't seem to acknowledge it. So we're switching over. We're going to be getting a dedicated server for the Last American Vagabond in the very near future. Hopefully we can fix it before then. I apologize for all the podcast users. For those that are listening to it, you can go directly to my website and download it right on the page of the article itself. So do that instead for the time being.
Yeah. Check out Last American Vagabond. It's on YouTube for a time being. You know, most of us are still, some of us are still on YouTube. But yeah, and definitely check out your articles. You have great people like Whitney Webb on your channel, Derek Bros, who's been on the show too. So you're doing great work, Ryan. I really, really appreciate it. And I won't take up any more of your time because I am known for long rants. So I'll try to keep this short. And I'll talk to you on the next one. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ricky.
Hey, take care.